Before we drift away, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more calming sleep stories. Sweet dreams await. The forest was heavy with rain that night, the kind that didn't fall in bursts but lingered, soaking everything it touched. Every branch sagged with weight, every patch of moss glistened as though alive, and the air smelled of wet pine and earth. The deeper you walked, the quieter the world became, until even the sound of the storm felt swallowed by the trees. At the edge of the old logging road stood the lodge. Its roof was dark with moss, its windows reflecting only shadows, and its chimney leaned as though it were tired of holding secrets. No one had lived there in years, or so the locals claimed, but the fire pit outside told a different story. Ashes, faintly warm, sat beneath the rain as if someone had been there not long before. The group of travelers hesitated as they approached. Their boots sank into the mud, their breaths quick in the misty cold. The forest behind them stretched endlessly, and turning back was no longer an option. Ahead was shelter, crumbling, eerie, but shelter nonetheless. "Do we really want to stay here?" one of them asked, his voice nearly lost to the steady drumming of the rain. Another answered with a nervous laugh, "Better than freezing out there." They circled around the lodge, drawn toward the fire pit. Even in the rain, the faint smell of burned wood lingered, and something else, something metallic, sharp, and unsettling. When the wind shifted, it carried whispers, too faint to understand, but too real to ignore. One by one they felt it, the sense of being watched. The forest pressed in close, the branches curling like fingers, the rain muting everything except the beating of their own hearts. And as they stood before the lodge, a flicker of light appeared in the upstairs window, brief like a candle being lit, then smothered. They were no longer alone. The rain refused to ease. It came down in sheets, washing the forest in a silver curtain, blurring shapes between trees, making every shadow seem alive. The group lingered outside the lodge longer than they wanted to, staring at its sagging frame and weather-beaten boards. It was the kind of building that seemed to breathe in the dark, each creak of wet timber echoing like a warning. The front door stood crooked, the wood swollen from years of storms. Nails stuck out at odd angles, and its iron latch was coated in rust. No footprints marked the mud before it, yet the fire pit said someone had been there. Someone close. "Maybe the light was just our imagination," whispered Anna, her hood dripping, her hands clenched tight around her backpack straps. Her voice shook not from cold, but from something else, something none of them wanted to name. "Imagination doesn't leave warm ashes," Mark muttered, crouching to stir the pit with a wet branch. He frowned, watching steam rise from beneath the blackened wood. He didn't say the rest, but they all thought it. Someone had been sitting there just before they arrived. Maybe minutes ago. Lightning tore across the sky, white and violent, briefly illuminating the trees. For a moment, the forest seemed endless, row upon row of dark trunks stretching into a mist that swallowed everything. And in that flash, one of them swore they saw movement, a shape slipping back between the trees, gone as quickly as it appeared. They didn't speak of it. Not yet. The lodge door loomed before them. Water dripped from the roof, splattering against the old steps. The air carried that strange metallic tang again, bitter at the back of the tongue. It reminded them of blood, though none wanted to say it aloud. Finally, James, the oldest of the group, stepped forward. "We don't have much choice. We're soaked through. If we stay out here, we'll freeze before morning." His voice was steady, but his hand trembled as he reached for the latch. The metal groaned under his grip, resisting, but then gave way with a heavy snap. The door shuddered open. The smell hit them first. Damp wood. Rot. The faint trace of something burnt, too sharp, not like campfire smoke, but acrid, lingering, clinging to the air. Their flashlights cut through the gloom, beams scattering across the lodge interior. Dust floated like ash in the air. The room beyond was wide, lined with old wooden beams. The floorboards sagged, warped from water damage, but still held together. A stone fireplace yawned at the far wall, its hearth cold and filled with the remnants of charred logs. But it was the chairs that made them stop. Four of them. Old, wooden, arranged in a circle in the center of the room. Each one tilted slightly, as though someone had sat there and only just stood up. A threadbare rug lay beneath, damp and darkened, as though it had soaked up more than rainwater. The room whispered with silence. Thunder rolled in the distance, low and heavy, rattling the windows. For a long time no one moved. Their breaths were shallow, their nerves stretched thin. Finally, Anna broke the quiet, her voice hushed but urgent. "Who leaves a fire outside in the rain, and chairs like this inside? Someone's here. Or was." Her words hung in the air, and the storm seemed to press harder against the walls, as if listening. Then they heard it. A sound from upstairs. A slow, dragging shift across the boards, too heavy to be the house settling, too deliberate to be the storm. Someone was up there. The sound lingered in the silence, low and deliberate, a weight dragging across old wood. Each step overhead groaned as though the beams themselves protested the movement. The group froze, their flashlights trembling in their hands, beams of pale light cutting through the stale air. No one spoke at first. It was as though the storm itself had hushed, waiting. Rain pounded against the roof, a constant drum, but above it the sound continued, measured, unhurried, as if whoever or whatever was upstairs wanted them to know it was there. James tightened his jaw and raised a hand, signaling the others to keep still. His flashlight beam swept across the chairs in the center of the lodge, then up the staircase that spiraled into shadow. The wood there looked brittle, slick with age, as if it might collapse under a single misplaced step. "Could be an animal," Mark whispered, though his own voice betrayed doubt. No animal moved like that. No raccoon or deer dragged its feet slowly across the floor, pausing between steps like it was listening. Anna shifted closer to the fireless hearth, her back pressed against cold stone. Her eyes wouldn't leave the ceiling, her breath quickening with each drawn-out creak. The beam of her flashlight quivered against the wood above, as if it might reveal the shape through the floor. Another sound followed, softer this time, a low thud. Something heavy being set down. The smell in the air thickened. Not just damp wood and mold, but something sharper like scorched metal. It stung their noses, coating their throats. "We should leave," Anna whispered, her voice cracking. "Right now. Back to the forest. I don't care about the rain." But James shook his head. Back to the forest means wandering blind all night. We don't know where the road even is anymore. His voice was steady, but his knuckles were white where he gripped his flashlight. Silence returned upstairs, sudden and complete. The absence of sound was worse than the noise. It stretched, pressing on them, thick as the storm outside. Mark swallowed hard. Maybe it stopped. The words had barely left his mouth when another sound came. Not footsteps. Not a thud. A scrape. Wood against wood, sharp and deliberate, like a chair being dragged slowly across the floor. Every beam of light snapped upward, trembling as they tried to pierce through ceiling boards too thick and too old. The sound continued, steady, slow, then halted with a sharp jolt, echoing down the staircase. The silence that followed was suffocating. Thunder split the sky outside, shaking the windows in their frames. The storm was relentless now, the kind that drowned out every thought, every instinct, except one. They weren't alone. James's voice was barely audible when he spoke. "We stay together. No one goes upstairs. Not yet." The group huddled near the center of the room, their backs close, flashlights cutting wild arcs across the damp walls. Their breaths sounded too loud, their hearts thundering louder than the storm. Then, as if answering James directly, the floor above them creaked again. Not a footstep this time. A shift of weight. As though someone had crouched down directly above them, listening. And in that moment, each of them realized the truth. Whatever was upstairs, knew they were there. The ceiling groaned again, that awful bending of timber under weight. But this time it didn't sound like wandering footsteps. It was still. Heavy. A presence pressing down through the boards as if something had settled directly above them, crouched low, waiting. The air in the lodge grew stifling. The mold, the rot, the faint metallic sting. It was as if the building itself exhaled around them, holding them in its damp chest. No one dared to move. The storm raged outside, yet in that room it felt smothered, hushed, the rain and thunder distant compared to the deafening silence of whatever was upstairs. Anna's flashlight beam quivered across the ceiling, landing on a dark spot near the center where the wood sagged. Her voice broke when she whispered, "It's right above us." James's hand tightened on her shoulder. "Don't say that." Mark's jaw clenched, his grip white-knuckled on the handle of his flashlight. "I'm not sitting here like prey. If someone's up there..." "Someone?" Anna cut him off, her tone sharp, desperate. "You really think that's someone?" The words hung in the air like a curse. No one responded. Another scrape cut through the silence. Not the slow dragging of furniture this time. Sharper. Close. A single sound like fingernails, or claws, running down wood. It came from the staircase. Every flashlight beam swung in that direction. The staircase loomed, narrow, steep, the railing broken halfway up. Shadows pooled thick in its angles, the top swallowed by darkness. And there, where the boards met the first step, fresh scratches gleamed pale against the wet wood. They hadn't been there before. A low boom of thunder shook the glass panes, and the rain lashed harder against the roof. In the strobing light from outside, the lodge seemed alive, walls flexing, beams groaning, windows trembling. The group pressed together, their circle shrinking as though the fireless hearth might protect them. "Listen," James said, his voice hushed but firm. "Whatever's here wants us scared. We hold out until morning. Then we leave. Together." But morning felt impossibly far away. The sound came again. A dragging, deliberate motion, this time across the railing. The wood creaked as if under a caress. The image that filled their minds wasn't of a person leaning casually there, but something hunched, something patient, raking its claws along the splintering banister. Anna's breath hitched. She turned her beam toward the upstairs landing, and for a heartbeat, just one, there was reflection. Not glass, not metal. 2 pinpoints of light, too high, too still, shining back at her through the dark. She screamed, the sound cracking through the lodge louder than the thunder. The lights vanished. Mark cursed, stumbling backward. His light swept wildly across the ceiling beams, the staircase, the walls. "What did you see? What was it?" "Eyes," Anna gasped, her hands trembling as she kept her beam locked on the landing. "Something was watching us. It was right there." The room seemed to pulse with her words. The storm hammered harder, lightning flaring through the tall windows, painting the interior with sharp bursts of white. Each flash carved shadows deeper into the corners. James raised his voice, steady, commanding. "We barricade the door. If it tries to come down those stairs, we'll hear it." He moved quickly, dragging one of the old wooden chairs toward the front door. The others followed, their nerves taut but desperate for control. They shoved chairs, broken planks, anything they could find against the entryway. The screech of wood on wood echoed like screams in the hollow lodge. When it was done, they stepped back, breathing hard, staring at their makeshift wall of rot and splinters. It wouldn't stop much, but it felt like something. Then from upstairs came a sound that froze them cold. Not footsteps. A laugh. Soft. The kind that didn't belong in a human throat. And it didn't stop. It stretched, thin and broken, echoing through the timbers until it became impossible to tell if it was real, or if the storm itself was laughing with it. The group pressed tighter together, and in that moment, every single one of them understood the same dreadful truth. Whatever was upstairs had always known they were coming. The laugh didn't echo long. It cut off sharply, like a blade through rope, leaving the group in a silence more suffocating than before. The storm rattled the windows, but even the thunder seemed distant now, as though the forest itself had drawn in closer, listening. James's throat bobbed as he forced down fear. He didn't speak right away. None of them did. Each second stretched painfully, until the only sounds left were the storm outside and their shallow breathing. Anna clutched her flashlight so tightly her knuckles ached. "We can't stay here," she whispered. Her eyes never left the staircase. "It knows we're here. It doesn't care." Mark shook his head, pacing in the small circle they'd created around the fireplace. "And go where? Into the woods? In this storm? You saw how far the road stretched. There's no way we'll find our way out at night. The lodge is all we've got." "The lodge isn't keeping us safe," Anna snapped, her voice cracking. "It's keeping us in." The word struck them like a hammer. Each of them thought the same thing but hadn't dared to voice it, that the building itself felt like a trap, like stepping through its swollen door had sealed something behind them. Then the sound came again. A single step. The staircase groaned under pressure, not loud but deliberate. Every flashlight beam shot to the railing. They saw nothing, only the broken banister, the dark landing above, and the shadow of the hallway vanishing deeper into the second floor. Another step followed. Slow. Heavy. Something was coming down. James raised a hand, urging them back. His other hand clenched around the flashlight, its pale circle trembling on the staircase. "Stay behind me." His voice was steady, but his shoulders betrayed a tightness, as though ready to snap at any moment. Mark whispered, "If it's a person, we can talk to them." But his own tone betrayed how little he believed it. No one laughed like that. No one dragged their body like that across the floor. The third step came. Louder now. The wood bowed beneath weight, and for a flicker, the shadows at the top of the stairs seemed to shift. A shape leaned forward, just enough to break the black. Anna gasped and stumbled back, her flashlight catching what looked like a leg, thin, too thin, bare skin stretched pale and mottled, gleaming slick in the beam as though soaked in rain. But there was no sound of dripping. The shape froze in the light, unmoving. James's beam joined hers, hitting the same patch of shadow. But when both lights met, it was gone, as though nothing had ever been there. The staircase was empty again, but the wood creaked. Something was crouching on the steps, just out of sight, just where the light couldn't reach. They could hear it, the faintest rasp of breath, like air being pulled through broken reeds. "Do you hear that?" Anna whispered, tears welling in her eyes. They all did. The breathing. Shallow, labored, as though whatever crouched there strained with every inhale, savoring every exhale. Mark snapped. He grabbed a heavy branch of firewood from beside the hearth, clutching it like a club. "I'm not waiting for this thing to crawl down here. If it wants us, it can come through me first." He stormed 2 steps toward the staircase before James caught his arm. "Don't." Too late. The breathing stopped. Then came a rush, not footsteps but something sliding, leaping, hurtling down the staircase with impossible speed. Flashlights whipped upward, beams scattering wildly. For an instant, they caught a blur, long limbs, a pale flash, fingers dragging against the railing with a screech that split the air. Mark raised the branch, shouting, swinging blindly. The thing halted just at the bottom step, out of reach, retreating into shadow so fast it seemed to melt into the boards. The lodge was silent again. Mark stood panting, the firewood raised like a weapon, his eyes wide. It was right there, he couldn't finish. His words crumbled into ragged breaths. The others said nothing. Their lights swept back and forth, searching desperately. Nothing remained. No figure. No face. Just shadows that seemed darker than before, pressing tighter against the corners of the room. Then, faint, so faint it was almost drowned by the storm, came a sound from upstairs again. The dragging scrape of a chair sliding across the floor. The group realized with horror that it had gone back up. Back to where it had been waiting. And worse, it wanted them to follow. No one spoke for a long time. The rain crashed against the roof, rivers pouring down warped shingles, drumming against the broken gutters like hollow bones. Every few seconds, thunder rolled, deep and slow, the kind that rattled the glass in the windows and shook dust loose from the rafters. But inside the lodge, beneath the storm's noise, there was something else. Something quieter. The scrape of the chair above them hadn't stopped. It had started faint, almost delicate, but as seconds stretched into minutes, the dragging became more deliberate. A long, slow pull of wood against wood, then a pause as though waiting for a reaction. Then another scrape. Each movement vibrated through the ceiling beams, a steady reminder that the thing upstairs was not gone. It was arranging something. James's jaw tightened as he looked toward the staircase. His flashlight beam wavered up the broken railing. He was trying to be brave, to hold the group together, but his breathing betrayed him, short, sharp, uneven. Anna stood close to the hearth, hugging herself, rocking slightly. Her light pointed uselessly at the floor, her knuckles white around the handle. She couldn't bring herself to look up anymore. Mark still gripped the firewood branch, his chest rising and falling like he had just run miles. His knuckles bled where splinters had dug in, but he hadn't noticed. His eyes were locked on the stairs, wide and red. Then came a new sound. A knock. Soft. On the far wall of the upstairs. 1, 2, 3 taps. Then silence. The group flinched together as though struck. Another knock followed, closer this time. The sound was slow, deliberate, traveling across the wall toward the staircase. It wasn't footsteps anymore. It was knocking, moving room to room above them, the rhythm steady, purposeful. Anna whispered, "It's listening to us." No one argued. The knocking stopped suddenly. For a moment there was only the storm. Then came something worse. A whisper. At first it sounded like the hiss of the rain slipping through the cracks in the roof. But no, it was clearer. A voice, low and wet, speaking words that didn't belong to any language they knew. The sound drifted down the staircase, curling through the air like smoke, curling inside their ears like it was being spoken directly into their skulls. Mark staggered back, clutching his head. "Stop it," he hissed, his voice sharp, panicked. "It's in my head." The whisper grew louder, words layered over words, voices over voices. It wasn't one voice now, it was dozens. Too many. Men, women, children, their tones overlapping in broken fragments. Laughter, sobs, chants. The sound filled the entire lodge, rising and falling like the storm outside. The flashlights flickered. James grabbed Anna by the wrist, snapping her back to focus. "Don't listen. Don't answer it. Do you hear me? Don't say a word." But Anna's lips had already parted, her breath hitching as if she were on the verge of speaking back. Her eyes were unfocused, fixed on the staircase, her pupils blown wide as though staring into something no one else could see. James shook her hard, snapping her out of it. She gasped, covering her mouth with her hands, choking back a sob. Then it all stopped. The whispers, the knocking, even the scraping upstairs. The silence was immediate, absolute. The only sound left was the storm, the endless rain washing against the roof. But it was worse this way. The silence inside the lodge felt intentional, heavy, as though the thing upstairs had heard enough. Mark's voice shook when he finally broke it. "What does it want from us?" No one answered. The fireless hearth crackled suddenly. Not with flame, there was no flame, but with the sound of burning. Smoke curled up from the cold ashes, pale and thin, carrying with it that metallic scent, stronger now, thick enough to sting their eyes. The smoke twisted upward, coiling like a hand. And from upstairs, from the landing cloaked in shadow, came the sound of something inhaling deeply. It was breathing in the smoke. The smoke drifted higher, curling from the blackened hearth as though coaxed out of nothing, strands of gray twisting together into shapes that didn't make sense to the eye, shapes that shifted if you looked at them too long. The air thickened with that metallic sting, biting the back of their throats, making their eyes water. James coughed, pulling Anna away from the hearth, but she stared at it wide-eyed, transfixed, as if the curling smoke were speaking to her. Mark swore under his breath, waving the firewood he held as if it might scatter the smoke, but the strands only seemed to bend around his motions, almost playfully, like it was aware of them. The storm outside roared, thunder rolling so loud the windows shook in their frames, yet inside the lodge the smoke moved in time with the rhythm of something else, something upstairs. With every inhale they heard above, the smoke pulled tighter toward the landing, threads stretching upward into the shadows where no light could reach. And then came that sound again, the long, ragged breath of something feeding. Anna broke free of James's grip and staggered toward the staircase, her movements jerky like a sleepwalker. "It's calling me," she whispered, her voice distant, hollow, not her own. James lunged and caught her, dragging her back, his voice low and desperate. "Don't look at it. Don't listen. That's not you talking." But Anna fought, her eyes wide and wet, whispering words she didn't seem to understand. "It wants me. It needs me." Then the smoke shifted, collapsing suddenly like a snapped thread, sinking back into the hearth and vanishing. The air cleared in an instant, the metallic taste gone, leaving only the damp rot of the lodge and the pounding of the rain outside. Anna blinked, trembling, and then clung to James, sobbing into his shoulder, whispering over and over that she didn't remember what she had said. Silence pressed heavy against them once again, a silence that felt thick and listening. Mark broke it with a sharp, frantic laugh, the sound too loud in the empty space. "It's toying with us. That's all it's doing. Playing. Moving things. Making noises. Whispering in our heads. It hasn't touched us. Not yet." His words trailed off as if he realized too late the weight of what he had said. Not yet. The storm surged, a crash of thunder rattling the entire lodge, and for a split second, every window flared with the blinding light of lightning. In that flash, all three of them saw it. At the top of the staircase, crouched low against the railing, was a shape. Too long, too thin, its limbs bent in ways that made no sense, its skin pale like stretched parchment. Its head tilted sharply to the side, neck too long as though curious. They saw its eyes then, black pits that caught the light for just a moment, reflecting not white, not silver, but a dull, wet red. Then the flash was gone and the staircase was empty once more. Anna screamed into James's chest. Mark stumbled back, clutching the firewood like a cross. James kept his light trained on the landing, his voice shaking despite his efforts. "It's watching. Waiting." As if answering him, the floor above them groaned again, not with footsteps, but with the heavy creak of something crawling low to the ground. It moved slowly, deliberately, across the boards, circling. Then came the sound of more chairs scraping against the floor above, dragged into place, one by one, forming a pattern they couldn't see. The sound echoed through the beams, chilling them more than any scream could. Whatever was up there wasn't random. It wasn't mad. It was preparing. The scraping of the chairs didn't stop. It went on, steady, deliberate, like someone setting the stage for a performance. Each drag of wood across the warped boards upstairs sent a vibration through the ceiling, down the beams, into the very floor beneath their feet. James gritted his teeth, trying to steady his breath, but his hand shook where it held the flashlight. Anna pressed herself deeper into his chest, whispering under her breath, "It's arranging something. It's building something." Mark turned in frantic circles, his flashlight beam jittering across the lodge walls, catching glimpses of water-stained wood, peeling wallpaper, broken furniture that seemed to shift in the corners as though shadows were alive. "We can't sit here and let it do whatever it's doing. We have to stop it," he said, but even he didn't sound convinced. The storm outside roared in agreement, slamming the windows with torrents of rain, making the glass rattle like teeth. Lightning split the sky again, and for a fraction of a second, The whole upstairs hallway was illuminated. James caught his breath. The chairs had been dragged into a circle, just like the one in the room below them, but this one was tighter, closer, angled inward, as if meant for something to sit at the center. Worse, there weren't 4 chairs anymore. There were 5. His stomach dropped. There had only been 4 in the room downstairs. His eyes flicked to the circle behind them, and his blood ran cold. The rug where the 4 chairs had been? Empty. The circle was gone. The chairs had moved, silently, without a sound, leaving only the dark impression in the damp fabric. "Oh God," Anna whispered, realizing it too. "They're upstairs now." The silence stretched sharp and thin, and then came the sound of weight shifting again. Slow, dragging movement on the ceiling, pacing around the newly formed circle. The thing was walking between the chairs, inspecting them as if waiting for something, or someone, to join. James tightened his grip on Anna, lowering his voice. "We don't go up there. Do you hear me? Whatever it wants, we don't give it." But Anna was shaking her head, her eyes wide and wet. "It already took them. It already moved them. It doesn't need our permission." Mark suddenly lurched toward the staircase, holding the firewood like a weapon. "I'm not waiting to be picked off like a rabbit in a snare. If it's up there, then it bleeds like anything else." His boots pounded against the floor as he reached the bottom step. James lunged after him, grabbing his arm hard. "Don't. That's what it wants." But before either could move again, the noise above shifted. No longer dragging chairs. No longer pacing. A new sound filled the lodge, sharp and precise, like nails tapping on wood. 1 tap for each second. Tap, tap, tap. It came from the staircase itself now, halfway up, as if marking the rhythm of a countdown. The 3 of them froze, their flashlights locked on the railing. Tap, tap, tap. And then it stopped. Silence. The storm outside seemed to hold its breath, the rain muffled, the thunder delayed. For an instant the world was too quiet, too still, as though time itself had bent. Then came the exhale. A long, wet, rattling breath that seemed to crawl down the staircase and wrap around their ankles like fog. Anna whimpered, her hands flying to her ears. "It's right there," she cried. "It's right on the stairs." The flashlights shook as they aimed higher, beams trembling against the cracked wood and rotting railing. And in the dim glow at the 7th step they saw it. A hand. Pale. Thin. The fingers impossibly long, curling around the edge of the step, nails yellow and cracked, dragging grooves into the wood as it gripped tighter. It wasn't climbing. Not yet. It was just holding there, still waiting, letting them see. James stumbled back, pulling Anna with him. Mark raised the firewood again, his breath heaving, his fight or flight thrashing inside his chest. But none of them moved closer. None of them dared. Then, just as slowly as it had appeared, the hand slid back into shadow, leaving deep scratches behind in the wood. The tapping resumed upstairs, faster now, frantic, like applause. The rain had become steadier, hammering down on the roof of the lodge with a rhythm that felt almost too deliberate, like a drumbeat echoing through the woods. Inside, the fire still fought to live, though its flames had dwindled to a glow that cast long shadows across the cabin walls. The group sat closer together now, their nerves fraying with every groan of the old wooden beams, every hiss from the forest beyond the dripping windows. No one wanted to say it out loud, but all of them felt it. Something had shifted, something had decided to stay near. When Jack finally spoke, his voice was so low it was nearly a whisper, but everyone heard him. He said that when he'd gone out earlier to fetch more wood, he'd seen footprints. Not animal prints, not boots or shoes, bare feet, larger than his own, pressed into the wet earth, leading from the treeline directly toward the lodge. They were fresh, too fresh for comfort. His words sank into the silence like a stone dropped into deep water, and nobody moved for several seconds. Then Claire, trembling, said she'd noticed something through the window while he was gone, a shape leaning at the edge of the trees, tall and thin, unmoving. She hadn't wanted to alarm anyone, so she told herself it was just her mind playing tricks, but hearing Jack's story made her sick with dread. The fire popped, making everyone flinch, and in that moment it became clear that whatever was outside, if it was outside, knew exactly where they were. The rain masked sound, cloaked movements, made the world just beyond the window impossible to read. The group debated whether they should barricade the door or stay quiet and pretend they weren't home, but that felt ridiculous. They'd made too much noise already, and if something had followed Jack's path back to the cabin, it knew they were inside. Dylan suggested leaving, but the idea of stepping out into the rain-drowned woods under that watchful presence froze them where they sat. Then came the tapping. Slow, deliberate, on the side of the cabin. A knuckle, maybe, or something harder striking the wood. Everyone froze, eyes snapping toward the sound. Another tap followed, this one closer to the window, then silence again. The storm seemed to hush for a moment, the patter on the roof distant, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. And then, from the shadows outside, came a sound no one could explain. A long, low hum that vibrated through the glass, neither fully human nor fully inhuman, carrying with it a strange resonance that made the walls quiver. It went on for what felt like an eternity before fading into the rain again. No one dared move. The fire gave a dying sigh, the last flames collapsing into embers, and the lodge dimmed into near darkness. Somewhere outside, hidden by trees and rain, something was waiting, watching. The campfire's memory still lingered in the smell of smoke, but it felt like a fragile shield against the dark pressing in from every side. The group clung to silence, praying the night would pass without the thing outside trying the door. But deep down, each of them knew the night was far from over. No one slept. They didn't even try. The cabin air felt heavier with every passing minute, every creak of the rafters, every hiss from the storm outside. The sound of the rain had stopped being comforting. It had become a mask, a constant wall of noise that hid whatever moved beyond the window panes. Claire sat with her knees pulled to her chest, rocking slightly, her eyes darting toward the glass every time the lightning flashed, half expecting to see a pale face staring in. Dylan kept pacing the length of the room despite the uneven floorboards, muttering to himself that they had to leave, that staying was suicide. Jack sat by the dying fire, gripping the poker like a weapon, though his knuckles trembled around the iron shaft. For a while, no one said anything. Then came another sound, not a tap this time, but a dragging. Long and deliberate, circling the cabin like something testing the walls, tracing its way around the lodge. Everyone froze, heads turning toward the noise as it passed from one side of the cabin to the next, slow and patient. It stopped just beneath the far window, the one facing the treeling. The glass was dark, too wet with rain to see through, but the silence that followed felt unbearable. Then a breath. Condensation bloomed across the inside of the glass as if someone, or something, were breathing against it from the outside. Claire let out a strangled cry, muffled by her hand as she pressed it to her mouth, while Dylan stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. The breath lingered for a moment, then smeared away as though a palm had dragged across it. Nobody dared move closer. The storm pressed on, thunder rumbling like distant drums, but what followed next drove the final nail of terror into them all. A voice. Faint at first, so faint they thought it might be the wind, but no, it grew clearer with each word. "Let me in." The voice was low, rasping, but undeniably human. It came from right outside the window. Claire began to sob quietly, shaking her head, whispering, "No, no, no," over and over. Dylan backed into the far wall, clutching his chest like his heart might tear itself free. Jack stood slowly, raising the poker, his eyes wide but locked on the sound. "You hear it too," he whispered, almost to himself, as though he needed confirmation. "We all hear it." The voice came again, softer this time, almost coaxing. "It's cold out here. Let me in." Nobody moved toward the window. Nobody dared. The fire gave one last flicker, then died completely, plunging the cabin into near total darkness except for the faint silver flash of lightning seeping through the wet glass. The storm howled, but that voice cut through it, threading itself into their ears like a needle through cloth. When the thunder cracked again, it was louder than before, shaking the walls, but for a split second in the flash of light, they all saw it. A figure at the window. Gaunt, tall, its face pressed too close to the glass, eyes that glowed faintly in the storm's strobe. And when darkness fell again, the voice whispered one last time, "I already know the door is open." The lodge felt impossibly small now, every corner of the room pressing in on them like a trap. The storm outside hadn't eased, but the rain had stopped sounding comforting long ago. It was nothing but a constant drumbeat masking the horror that stalked outside. Claire clutched herself tighter, her knuckles white, her gaze locked on the wet, darkened window where the figure had pressed its face only moments ago. Jack gripped the poker like a lifeline, though his arms shook with exhaustion and fear. Dylan backed into the corner, hands over his ears, muttering under his breath that they had to leave, had to run, but the thought of stepping into the rain-drenched forest with whatever lurked just beyond the lodge made him freeze. Then came another sound, soft at first, almost imperceptible over the storm. A slow, deliberate scratching, like fingernails dragging across wood, coming from the side door they had barricaded with chairs and planks. Everyone stiffened, flashlights swinging toward the sound, beams trembling in the near dark. The scratching became more frantic, faster, more purposeful, as though whatever was outside testing their barriers had grown impatient. A low, wet hiss followed, almost a whisper, curling into their ears like smoke. "Let me in," it breathed again, the voice twisting impossibly, sliding between human and something else entirely, a sound that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. Claire sobbed quietly, hiding her face in her knees, while Dylan clutched the corner of a chair, rocking slightly, eyes wide and unblinking. Jack squared his shoulders, raising the poker higher, and muttered, "It can't come in. It can't." But even as he said it, the scratching stopped, replaced by silence so thick it seemed to weigh the air down, pressing against their chests. Then the side door creaked, not a full opening, just the faintest hint of movement, wood shifting under invisible weight. Their flashlights swung frantically toward it. Nothing. Only the shadows of warped boards dancing across the wet floor. The storm rattled again, and lightning illuminated the edges of the lodge in stark white light. For a heartbeat, just long enough to make them all hold their breath, a shape appeared at the door. A pale, impossibly tall form, crouched unnaturally low, limbs bent in ways that should have been impossible, dragging along the floor as it moved. Its head turned toward them, and even in that flash they could see its eyes, black pits glimmering faint red, reflecting the lightning, staring directly at them, unblinking, calculating. Then it was gone, swallowed instantly by the darkness of the storm. A long silence followed, broken only by their own ragged breathing and the distant drum of rain. The fireless hearth emitted a faint hiss as embers settled into ash, and the metallic tang lingered in the air, sharper now, biting the back of their throats. Dylan whispered hoarsely, "It's inside." Jack froze, teeth clenched. No, not possible. It's outside. It can't." But before he could finish, a heavy knock sounded on the floorboards above, the ceiling trembling with the impact. Not once, but several times, a slow, deliberate pounding, each strike vibrating through the timbers as if something immense had set itself down, pacing above their heads. Claire screamed this time, a raw, guttural sound, curling into the shadows, and Anna, who had remained silent until now, pointed toward the staircase. "It's coming down," she whispered, voice quivering like a leaf in the storm. Jack, Dylan, and the others swung their flashlights toward the staircase, every beam shaking uncontrollably. Nothing. But the floor above groaned again, heavier now, as if something massive crouched just beyond their line of sight. Then came a dragging sound, slow, deliberate, scraping along the floorboards, inching closer and closer to the top of the stairs, each movement measured, patient. The lodge seemed to shrink, the walls closing around them, the storm outside fading into an echo compared to the terror pressing in from above. The scraping stopped at the very top step, and in that instant the group realized the worst. Whatever it was had made it all the way down from the attic, or wherever it had been, and was now poised to descend fully into their space, patient, waiting, knowing they could see it, knowing they were paralyzed. Then a voice, soft and wet and impossibly close, breathed from the darkness above. "I've been watching. I know you're afraid. It's time to join me." The words hung in the air like poison, curling into their ears, filling their minds with icy dread. Every instinct screamed to run, to flee into the storm, but all they could do was huddle together, flashlights sweeping the staircase as the floorboards groaned with the weight of something moving, something unnatural, making its way down, step by step, toward them. The group could barely move, their bodies frozen, hearts hammering so violently it was a wonder they could still breathe. Every flash of lightning cast the lodge in stark relief, revealing the wet, warped wood of the floor, the broken furniture, and the shadows that clung to the corners like living things, but nothing prepared them for what came next. From the staircase above, a dragging sound grew louder, deliberate, the scrape of claws or nails across old wood, each step punctuated by a low, wet rattle that made the beams vibrate beneath their feet. Jack gripped the poker tighter, knuckles white, as he tried to keep his shaking flashlight aimed upward, its beam trembling and flickering over each broken step. Anna held Claire close to her chest, whispering prayers under her breath that did nothing to calm the terror. Dylan's eyes were wide and glassy, fixed on the landing above, muttering incoherent warnings to himself, as though speaking could keep the creature at bay. Then came a pause, long and pregnant with menace, as if whatever was at the top of the stairs had stopped to survey them, judging them. The silence that followed was suffocating, so heavy they could hear their own heartbeats echoing off the damp walls of the lodge. And then, in a movement so sudden it stole their breath, something dropped from the landing. A shadow, elongated and impossible, tumbled down the steps, landing with a thud that rattled the floorboards and sent splinters skittering across the room. The lights from their flashlights caught it for a brief, horrifying instant. A tall, gaunt figure, skin pale and slick, limbs bent in unnatural angles, fingers ending in cracked yellow nails that dug into the boards as it steadied itself. Its head turned slowly toward them, a grotesque imitation of curiosity, and in the dim strobe of lightning flashing through the rain-soaked windows, they saw the eyes again, black pools tinged with dull red, reflecting light like embers in a dying fire. Anna screamed and stumbled back into Jack's arms, shaking violently. Claire clutched her knees, trembling so hard that her teeth rattled. Dylan raised the firewood like a weapon, though it seemed pitiful against whatever horror had just descended the stairs. The thing moved toward them, slow, deliberate, each step punctuated by the wet, rasping sound of breath and nails scraping against wood. It didn't run. It didn't rush. It simply came, each movement deliberate, patient, savoring the fear that radiated from them like heat from a furnace. Jack tried to swing the poker, but the figure was faster than thought, slipping into the shadows at the edge of the light before he could make contact. The air thickened, damp and metallic, smelling of wet stone and rust. The temperature dropped, each exhale forming clouds that hung in the air like ghosts. Then the whispering began, faint at first, rising from the floorboards and walls, voices layered over one another, speaking in tones that were not quite human, syllables that twisted the tongue and bent the mind. You can't hide. You can't run. You belong to me, the voices hissed, weaving together into a single chant, suffocating and precise. Anna screamed again, pressing her hands to her ears, but the sound still penetrated, gnawing at her sanity. Dylan swung the branch wildly, catching nothing but shadow, and stumbled backward, crashing into a chair that toppled to the floor with a loud crack. The thing moved closer, now fully visible in the sickly strobe of lightning, its form contorting as if defying every law of flesh and bone. Its mouth opened in a silent scream, stretching unnaturally wide, a soundless void that seemed to pull at the very air, and in that instant, every instinct screamed for them to run, though nowhere felt safe. From the corner of the room, something shifted, a reflection of movement, the shadows of the walls stretching toward the creature as if the lodge itself were alive, conspiring. The figure paused, tilted its head, and in the silence between the thunderclaps, a voice, wet and low, slithered across the floorboards. Do not be afraid. You are mine now. The three of them huddled together, frozen, as the creature advanced, step by step, until it was only a few feet away, its black eyes burning into theirs with a hunger that chilled every nerve. The storm raged outside, lightning flashing, rain hammering the roof, but none of it mattered anymore. In the lodge, in the center of that wet, warped floor, the thing had arrived, and nothing would ever be the same. The lodge seemed to shrink around them, every wall pressing inward, every shadow curling closer as though the building itself had turned traitor. The thing that had descended the stairs stood mere feet from them now, impossibly tall, limbs bent at angles that made their stomachs churn, skin pale and wet, glistening in the fleeting lightning flashes. Its head tilted unnaturally, one eye catching the light and reflecting a dull red like molten coal, while the other remained hidden in shadow. Its mouth opened slightly, revealing teeth too long, too sharp, arranged in a grin that defied reason, and from it came no sound, yet the pressure of its presence pressed against their ears as if words were being spoken directly into their minds. Anna shrieked, but her voice was swallowed instantly by the thick air, leaving only a trembling echo in her chest. Claire clung to her, rocking back and forth, rocking with the terror that coursed through them all, while Dylan stumbled, tripping over splintered floorboards, his firewood clattering uselessly to the floor. Jack's poker rose again, his hands shaking uncontrollably, but the figure didn't flinch. It didn't move faster or retreat. It simply waited, a predator savoring the fear, the panic, the helplessness radiating from the three of them like heat. Then a sound came from above, the attic floorboards groaning under pressure. Something was moving up there again, something else, or perhaps more of the same. The whispers returned, this time louder, layered, growing more insistent, filling the lodge with a chorus of hissing voices that wrapped around their minds, squeezing, pulling, bending thoughts in unnatural ways. You cannot leave. You belong to me, the voices chanted, and each syllable felt like it scraped against the inside of their skulls. Anna's hands flew to her ears, but the sound penetrated, gnawing at her, filling her with visions she couldn't control. Hands reaching out from the walls, eyes opening in every corner, shadows crawling toward her. Dylan screamed and swung at the creature, only to find air where it had been, the figure melting into shadow as lightning illuminated it for the briefest moment. When the flash ended, it had moved closer again, impossibly fast, almost touching them, the smell of wet earth and decay pressing into their noses. The floor beneath them trembled as if responding to its presence, and from the corners of the lodge came a wet, dragging noise, the sound of something large and unseen, circling them, moving closer with each heartbeat. Jack shouted, "Hold together. "Don't separate," but his voice trembled, betraying him. And then the fireless hearth hissed again, tiny sparks bursting upward from the cold ash as if the lodge itself was reacting, shivering in fear or in anticipation, no one could tell. The creature tilted its head, and now it spoke. No, not with its mouth, but directly into their minds. A voice like wet stone and rusted metal reverberated inside their skulls. "I've been waiting. I've always been waiting. You cannot run. You cannot hide. Step into the circle." Their eyes shot to the staircase and then to the floor, where the shadows seemed to shift, forming a vague pattern, like a circle drawn in darkness, stretching out from the center of the room toward them. Claire whimpered, shaking her head, unable to move as the whispers grew louder, the voices chanting together in that alien language that made the room vibrate with menace. The creature stepped forward, each motion fluid and unnatural, scraping its claws lightly against the floorboards, marking its territory, closing the distance between them and whatever the pattern demanded. Anna's scream rose into the storm, but it was drowned by the pounding rain, the howl of the wind, and the chorus of voices now so loud that it was impossible to distinguish one from the other. They huddled together, backs pressed to one another, and for a moment time seemed to stop. The storm outside was a distant memory. The lodge was no longer shelter but a cage. The creature loomed above them, silent yet commanding, and the circle of shadows on the floor stretched as if reaching to pull them in. Every instinct told them to flee, but the pattern held them fast, a gravity beyond reason. Jack tried to swing the poker again, but the creature moved in a blur, closer, faster than any human should move. Anna felt something cold brush against her leg, and she screamed, jerking backward only to find empty air, yet the feeling of touch lingered, a phantom weight that pressed her toward the circle. The whispers crescendoed, voices overlapping in a maddening harmony, pulling at their minds, promising nothing but fear. Dylan tried to speak, to rally them, but his words caught in his throat as the creature tilted its head once more, eyes glinting red in the dim light, and from somewhere above, the attic floor groaned with an almost human sigh, a signal that more was coming, that they were surrounded now, trapped in the lodge with something that had waited far longer than any of them could comprehend. And then, without warning, it lunged, or perhaps it didn't. The perception of movement seemed impossible to track, appearing closer still, just at the edge of the circle of shadows, and for the first time, the three of them felt the full weight of its gaze, a crushing pressure, a certainty that the moment had come where hiding, running, and fighting were meaningless. The lodge trembled as though the building itself had inhaled, the storm outside raging like a beast, and the shadows reached out to pull them into the dark center, where the creature waited, patient, inevitable, hungry for what they could not yet comprehend but would soon be forced to confront. The air in the lodge thickened, heavy and suffocating, the damp smell of wet wood and decay pressing into their lungs, making each breath a labor. The storm outside raged as if in response to the terror inside, rain hammering the roof, thunder rolling so low it seemed to vibrate the very floor beneath their feet. Lightning cut the dark through the wet windows, brief and stark, illuminating the gaunt shape hovering at the edge of the circle of shadows. Its head tilted unnaturally, limbs bent like snapped branches, fingers long and pale, nails cracking against the old wood as it inched closer. The whispers had escalated into a cacophony, voices overlapping in a language that seemed almost alive, words slicing into their thoughts, promising pain, fear, and inevitability. Anna pressed herself into Jack, shaking uncontrollably, her eyes wide and reflecting the faint, wet red glow of the creature's eyes, while Claire clutched her knees, rocking, whispering over and over that they had to leave, they had to escape, but the words felt useless, swallowed by the oppressive dread. Dylan raised the firewood like a weapon, arms trembling, sweat mixing with rain that had seeped in through the warped windows and dripping ceiling, but the thing before them didn't flinch. It didn't even seem to acknowledge the weapon. It simply waited, each motion deliberate, measured as though calculating the exact moment to strike. And then the circle of shadows on the floor shifted. They hadn't noticed before, but it had grown, stretching outward, tendrils of darkness twisting and curling toward them, seeming almost sentient, moving independently of the creature. Their instinct screamed at them to step back, to flee, but the lodge had become a trap. The shadows pressed against them like hands, cold and unyielding, anchoring their feet, their bodies, making even the smallest motion feel impossible. The whispers merged into a single, wet, rasping voice inside their skulls. "Step into the circle. You cannot resist. It is time." Jack swung the poker wildly, but it passed through shadow and air, hitting nothing. The creature stepped forward, closer, and now they could see its mouth opening wider than any human jaw should, a cavernous black hole that seemed to draw light and warmth from the room. A thin, metallic smell filled the air, like rust and blood and wet earth. The shadows around the circle writhed in response, curling higher, stretching upward, forming jagged shapes that seemed to reach for them. Claire screamed, scrambling backward, and Anna tried to pull her up, but their movements were slow, sluggish, as though the very air resisted them. The creature moved again, fluidly, impossibly, closing the final few feet between itself and the trio. Its presence pressed on their minds like a physical weight, bending their thoughts, twisting them, making it hard to tell what was real and what was hallucination. From above, the attic groaned, floorboards creaking under the weight of something massive, and the sound of dragging began again, circling, pacing, filling the lodge with an anticipatory rhythm. The three of them realized, with horror, that whatever had been up there had not stayed in the attic. It had been preparing, waiting, and now the lodge itself seemed alive with its presence, every shadow, every echo, every groan of the old building participating in some orchestrated terror. Jack's eyes darted around, seeking any escape, any weapon, anything that could give them a chance, but the shadows stretched and twisted, the walls themselves seeming to close in, the creature's black-red eyes unblinking, watching, waiting. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a deafening roar inside their minds. "You cannot hide. You cannot flee. You belong to me." The creature's hand, impossibly long and pale, extended toward them, fingers curling as if to pull them into the darkness of the circle. The lodge seemed to tilt, the floorboards groaning, rain hammering harder, thunder crashing as though the heavens themselves were shaking in response. Anna screamed, Claire shrieked, Dylan shouted, but their voices were swallowed by the storm, by the weight of the shadows, by the oppressive presence of the thing in front of them. And then, in a moment so sudden it stole all breath from their bodies, the creature moved again, not stepping forward, not advancing, but appearing closer, impossibly close, its shadow merging with the darkness beneath their feet, tendrils of the circle lifting and curling toward them, binding them in place, and the whispers became a single, insistent command that filled every corner of their minds. "Step into the circle. Step into me. You cannot resist." The storm outside screamed in fury, but inside the lodge only one thing remained, the inevitability of the thing before them, patient, hungry, and ready to claim what it had been waiting for all this time. The lodge felt alive, every beam and floorboard trembling as though aware of the terror it sheltered. The shadows that had crept along the walls earlier now stretched across the floor, crawling toward the three of them like tendrils, intertwining with the dark circle that seemed to pulse beneath the creature's feet. The air was thick with metallic tang and wet decay, making it hard to breathe, and the storm outside had become a distant roar, muffled, almost irrelevant to the weight pressing down on their minds. The creature's presence was unbearable, each motion deliberate, impossible, yet somehow terrifyingly natural, as if it had always belonged to the lodge and the lodge to it. Anna's screams were raw and piercing, but they were swallowed instantly by the oppressive darkness, her voice reverberating back at her from every corner of the room as distorted echoes. Claire clung to her, rocking violently, whispering that they had to run, that they had to escape, but their legs felt glued to the floor, anchored by the shadows that now licked at their ankles, cold and unyielding. Dylan tried to pull free, swinging the firewood wildly, but each strike passed through nothing. The shadows absorbed it, twisting and writhing in response, reacting as if alive, drawing the three of them closer to the circle. Jack gritted his teeth, trying to steady his trembling hands as he raised the poker one last time, but he could feel it slipping from his control, powerless against the unnatural gravity of the darkness. The whispers escalated to a deafening crescendo, voices layered and overlapping, some human, some grotesquely warped, repeating in unison, "Step into the circle. Step into me. You belong to me. You belong to me." The creature's black-red eyes bored into theirs, and the room seemed to shrink, shadows stretching upward, the corners of the lodge folding inward as if reality itself was bending toward the will of the thing. And then it moved. Not walking, not stepping, but flowing, bending reality around it, the air itself thickening, carrying it closer without sound, a distortion that made their vision swim. Its hand extended again, impossibly long, fingers curling toward them like claws of shadow and bone. Anna tried to cry out, but the sound caught in her throat. Claire's body shook violently, limbs stiff with terror. Dylan's eyes were wide, frozen, every muscle in his body locked in fear. The shadows of the circle lifted, tendrils wrapping around their legs and arms, binding them to the floor. They could not move. The whispers filled every corner of their minds, every breath, every thought, echoing a single command, "Step forward. Step into me. Accept." Jack's grip on the poker faltered. He realized with sickening clarity that no weapon they held, no strength they possessed, could resist what waited in the center of the lodge. Lightning flared through the windows, revealing the full form of the creature. Impossibly tall, gaunt, limbs bent and elongated, skin slick like wet parchment, its face a grotesque parody of a human's, mouth stretching in a silent scream that seemed to consume light itself. And for the first time they noticed something else. More shadows coalescing from the corners of the room, writhing toward the creature, responding to it, feeding it, forming shapes that resembled hands, faces, screaming mouths, all pulling them closer to the center of the circle. The floorboards trembled, the lodge groaned, the storm outside roared, but none of it mattered. Time itself seemed to fracture, stretched thin by the impossibility of what they were facing. The whispers became louder still, the single command pressing on them with every ounce of force imaginable. Step forward. Step into me. Belong. Anna, Claire, and Dylan were now trapped, bound by shadows, anchored to the floor, eyes locked on the void where the creature hovered, waiting, patient, inevitable. The circle pulsed with black light, a void that seemed to suck warmth and hope from the lodge, and with a final, impossible motion, the creature's form coiled into the center of the circle, tendrils of shadow reaching outward, touching each of them, cold and alive, and they felt the pull of it, the inevitability, the hunger, the demand to surrender. Their breaths caught in their throats, every muscle screaming to resist, but it was no use. The whispers invaded deeper, a constant, insistent hammering of command that bent their wills, cracked their minds, and with one final surge, the shadows pulled them inch by inch toward the pulsing center, toward the creature waiting to claim them completely, and the lodge itself seemed to join in the effort, walls groaning, ceiling beams shaking, the storm outside roaring in approval as the darkness closed in. The room seemed to stretch and warp around them, the lodge no longer a familiar structure but a cage that twisted with the will of the thing at its center. The shadows that had ensnared their legs writhed like living serpents, pulling them inexorably toward the circle, coiling around their torsos, creeping up their arms, cold and wet, constricting with a patient, deliberate force. Anna screamed, a sound muffled by the oppressive darkness, tears streaming down her face as the tendrils of shadow tugged her closer to the pulsing black center. Claire tried to pull free, thrashing wildly, but the shadows tightened, entwining her legs and fingers, dragging her down toward the floorboards as though the lodge itself were swallowing her. Dylan clawed at the air, lunging, screaming, but the circle's pull was relentless, dragging him forward, and with every inch closer, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling their heads with a wet, rasping chant. Step into me. You belong. You belong. Jack's poker slipped from his grip as he realized the futility, the hopelessness, the inevitability pressing down on them. The creature at the center of the circle, tall, gaunt, limbs bent like broken trees, pale skin slick and glistening, mouth stretching impossibly wide, loomed over them. Its black-red eyes seemed to pierce their very minds, searching, weighing, judging, and each time lightning flashed through the wet windows, they glimpsed more horrors. Shapes coalescing in the shadows, faces screaming in silence, fingers stretching toward them, clawing through the darkness, all pulling them nearer. The lodge groaned as though alive, timbers cracking, floors trembling under the impossible weight pressing down from above. The storm outside surged, rain hammering against the roof, thunder rolling like the roar of some immense beast, but the lodge itself seemed to exist outside of natural time, governed only by the will of the thing at the center. Anna's body convulsed with terror, every fiber of her resisting, yet the shadows continued to pull her inexorably forward. Claire sobbed, pressing her face to Anna's shoulder, whispering in futile prayer, "Please, please, we have to get out," but the whispers coiled tighter around their minds, twisting their thoughts, erasing hope. Dylan's screams tore through the darkness, raw and ragged, echoing from the walls, yet they did nothing to disrupt the pull. The creature's presence grew heavier, the black void of the circle pulsating as if alive, each pulse drawing them closer, binding them more completely, until they could feel the cold, wet touch of it along their skin, tugging, claiming, demanding surrender. Then a sound unlike any other, a wet, sucking noise as if the darkness itself were inhaling, breathing in rhythm with the storm, echoing in the lodge, vibrating through every bone in their bodies. The walls themselves seemed to bend, the ceiling sagging, the floor quivering as the shadows merged into the circle, and the creature extended a hand, impossibly long and skeletal, toward them. The pull intensified, dragging their bodies inch by inch, pressing their faces closer to the void, their minds screaming in silent agony, fighting a resistance that was already failing. The whispers now were a chorus, chanting, commanding, pressing into every corner of their consciousness. You cannot resist. You belong. Step into the darkness. Step into me. And then, in the briefest flash of lightning, they saw it, hundreds of pale, elongated forms, shapes twisted and broken, emerging from the shadows of the walls, from the corners of the ceiling, crawling along the floor, joining the circle, each one reaching, stretching, pulling, a hive of impossibility feeding into the center, all driven by the singular will of the creature waiting for them. The lodge shook violently, splinters flying from the walls and ceiling, the storm outside a distant roar, the circle at the center pulsating with black light, and the pull became irresistible. Every step forward was a battle, yet their bodies moved anyway, limbs dragged toward the center, minds filled with whispers and visions of endless darkness, of cold and wet shapes swallowing them whole. Anna's scream died in her throat as the shadows curled around her completely. Claire's sobs turned into silent tears as the circle embraced her. Dylan's eyes widened in horror as he was drawn inexorably into the void. Jack tried to resist, tried to fight, but the pull was too strong, the darkness too alive, too hungry. And as the creature extended its maw, a black void stretching impossibly wide, the three of them were drawn into the pulsing heart of the circle, the whispers merging into a deafening roar inside their minds, the lodge shaking and groaning, the storm raging outside, and finally, in that impossible moment, the darkness claimed them completely. The lodge fell into a silence so complete it felt unnatural, as though the storm outside had ceased in shock, the rain frozen midair, thunder suspended in the sky. But the darkness inside pulsed, alive, still vibrating with the presence of what had claimed them. Anna, Claire, Dylan, and Jack were no longer recognizable as themselves. Their bodies had been drawn into the circle, bound by shadows that now oozed like liquid across the floorboards, seeping into every crack, twisting and writhing as if the lodge itself were a living entity feeding the creature's hunger. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a low, wet hum, resonant and impossible, filling the space, vibrating through the walls, through the very air, pressing into every corner, every nerve, every thought. It was the sound of inevitability, the sound of a hunger satisfied, momentarily yet patient, waiting for the next. The fire, extinguished long ago, had left behind only cold ashes, but the circle glowed faintly, black and pulsing like a heartbeat. Within it, the forms of the four trapped souls flickered, blurred, stretched, twisted, their faces pale, eyes wide, mouths opening and closing in silent screams. Outside, the storm continued, but it seemed distant now, inconsequential, unable to penetrate the oppressive weight of what existed inside. The creature at the center of the circle remained perfectly still, yet the lodge itself moved with it, floorboards groaning, walls bending slightly, shadows reaching outward like grasping fingers, anchoring the darkness in place. Time had no meaning here. Seconds stretched into minutes, minutes into hours, or perhaps it was only moments. Perception had fractured in the presence of the circle. Then, from somewhere above, from the attic or perhaps even beyond it, came a slow, deliberate scraping, the sound of claws against wood, methodical, patient. The creature's head tilted toward it, sensing, acknowledging, yet not moving. And then came the whisper, low, wet, inside their minds, a promise, a statement, a declaration. They are mine. All of this mine. And soon you too. Outside, the rain shifted, tapping against the windows differently now, lighter, almost hesitant, as though the storm itself had been warned, or was watching, witnessing what had transpired inside. Within the circle, shadows writhed, forming shapes that were almost human, almost familiar, yet grotesquely wrong. Faces distorted, fingers too long, limbs bent. The four trapped souls flickered within them, their features stretched in impossible angles, their eyes reflecting the black-red glow of the creature at the center. They tried to cry, to scream, to move, but the pull of the circle was absolute, a gravity born of darkness, an inevitability they could not resist. Jack's mind screamed for action, for resistance, but even thought itself became slippery, warped, bending under the pressure of the shadows. He felt himself merge, a part of the darkness, his screams swallowed before they left his lips, his identity folding into the will of the creature. The creature's mouth opened, impossibly wide, and the black-red glow intensified, expanding outward, enveloping the lodge in a pulse of unnatural heat and cold simultaneously, pressing the four into the floor, into the circle, into the darkness that had been waiting for them for longer than they could comprehend. And then, a sound unlike any other, a wet, echoing exhale filled with satisfaction and promise, that rolled through the lodge and spilled into the night outside, a signal that the lodge itself had been claimed, that the forest surrounding it had been marked, and that whatever had awakened tonight had not finished yet. The circle pulsed again, pulling, merging, devouring, and within that pulse, the four souls disappeared from sight, leaving only the faint echoes of whispers and wet, scraping noises that promised, "This is only the beginning." The lodge stood silent after that, rain hammering on the roof again as if nothing had happened, but the floorboards beneath the circle were warped, blackened, and twisted, holding the memory of the event in their very grain. Outside, the storm carried on, indifferent, masking the lingering presence, the hunger that still pulsed in the lodge's center, waiting patiently for the next to step inside, for the shadows to claim again, for the whispers to rise once more. The lodge was still, yet alive in a way that twisted reality itself. The storm outside had slowed to a relentless drizzle, the rain tapping against the windows in irregular, uneven rhythms, almost hesitant, as though the forest surrounding the lodge itself had been silenced by what had just occurred. Inside, the shadows still lingered, writhing slightly as if digesting the souls it had claimed, pulsing faintly in the center of the room like a living heart. The floorboards bore deep, blackened grooves, etched into them as if the lodge itself remembered every motion, every struggle, every scream that had filled the room. The air was heavy with a damp, metallic tang, the scent of wet earth, decay, and something more alien, something that made the back of the throat tingle and eyes water. The creature had vanished, at least in form, but its presence permeated the room, saturating every shadow, every corner, every creaking timber. It was patient, waiting, and now the lodge itself seemed like a trap designed to nurture its hunger, to wait for the next visitor foolish enough to step inside. Time felt fractured. Seconds stretched and folded in on themselves. The shadows moved subtly, almost imperceptibly, reaching out and retracting in rhythm with the lodge's heartbeat, and if one stared too long, they could swear the floorboards themselves were breathing, rising and falling under the weight of an invisible pulse. From somewhere above, a floorboard groaned, high in the attic, slow and deliberate, as though something was pacing, waiting for the next opportunity. The whispers returned, faint at first, curling at the edges of the mind, a cold, wet susurration that promised nothing but inevitability. It is patient. It waits. Remembers. It comes. The words were not spoken aloud, yet they filled the lodge like a physical presence, pressing against the skulls of anyone who might enter. Outside, the forest had gone quiet, the rain masking nothing, the wind still, and yet the lodge radiated something unmistakable, a hunger that waited for motion, for sound, for fear. The shadows at the center pulsed again, curling into shapes that resembled the four souls it had claimed, twisted and elongated, faces blurred into grotesque masks, frozen in eternal terror. The faint glow from the circle illuminated the warped floorboards and splintered furniture, showing the lodge as it truly was, a vessel, a trap, a feeding ground. From the forest beyond, a branch tapped against a window, almost softly, almost curious. The lodge seemed to shiver at the sound, the shadows reacting as though they had sensed a potential intrusion, a new victim. The whispers grew louder, layering themselves in a rhythmic chant, compelling and irresistible. Step inside. Step closer. Belong to the lodge. Belong to the darkness. Step inside and join us. Lightning flashed far in the distance, revealing wet, gnarled trees that leaned closer, as though peering at the lodge, and for a brief instant, the shadows on the floor seemed to stretch outward, reaching toward the forest, seeking something beyond. The lodge waited. The circle pulsed. The creature's hunger lingered in every splintered board, in every warped shadow, in every drop of rain that ran down the windows. And in the silence, heavy and complete, a single truth hung in the air. Nothing had ended. Not really. The lodge still breathed, still waited, still hungered. And someday, inevitably, it would feast again. The forest beyond the lodge was quiet now, unnaturally quiet, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Rain had slowed to a persistent drizzle, each drop splattering against the mossy earth with a soft, hollow sound, echoing faintly through the stillness. The wind had died down, leaving only the faint rustle of leaves that whispered secrets too subtle for the mind to grasp. The lodge sat at the center, dark and oppressive, its windows slick with water, reflecting the faint, pulsing glow from within that came from the black circle, still alive, still hungry. The air around the building was heavy, saturated with the metallic, wet scent of decay and the faintest hint of something older, something that smelled of cold stone and soil turned over after years undisturbed. Shadows stretched across the floorboards, curling and twitching as though they were alive, forming shapes that mimicked the four souls it had claimed. Twisted, elongated, faces frozen in terror, limbs bent at impossible angles. The lodge groaned occasionally, a low, resonant sound that vibrated through the floor, through the walls, as if the building itself had a pulse now, breathing in rhythm with the circle at its center. And the whispers returned, faint at first, then rising, curling around the ears, pressing into the skull like cold fingers, wet and insistent. It waits. It watches. It hungers, remembers, you cannot resist. The words carried a weight that pressed on any who might listen, bending thoughts, twisting resolve, erasing hope before it could form. Outside, the forest remained still, but the occasional branch tapped against the lodge windows, a soft, deliberate sound that sent shivers through the air. Every creak of a floorboard inside echoed too loudly, amplified by the oppressive darkness that filled every corner of the building. And then came the sound from above, the attic groaning again, slow, deliberate, the unmistakable scrape of claws or nails against the wood. It was methodical, patient, a predator testing the limits of its domain, and the shadows below responded, writhing and curling toward the ceiling as though acknowledging the presence above. Inside the lodge, the circle pulsed once more, a black heart throbbing with an unnatural rhythm, and the shapes within it moved slightly, flickering, twisting, as if replaying the terror of the four it had claimed, a silent, eternal reminder of its power. The faint glow of the circle stretched outward, reaching across the warped floorboards, touching the walls, creeping toward the corners where shadows gathered, lingering with ascension patience, waiting for the next stir, the next movement. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the wet forest, revealing gnarled trunks that leaned slightly toward the lodge as if curious, as if drawn to the pulse of the darkness inside. The whispers rose again, louder now, almost a chant, curling in on itself in a rhythm impossible to ignore. Step closer. Step inside. Belong. Join us. You cannot resist. And as the lodge sat in the rain-soaked forest, dark and waiting, a faint tapping sounded at the front door, slow, deliberate, patient. Whoever, or whatever, stood outside was testing the lodge's boundaries, and the building responded with a subtle shiver, shadows reaching toward the threshold as though welcoming its guest. The storm continued at a distance, indifferent, masking nothing, while the lodge breathed in anticipation, alive with hunger, with memory, with patience. And inside, the circle pulsed, faint and black, whispering the promise that nothing had ended, that the hunger remained eternal and inevitable, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to enter its embrace. The front door of the lodge creaked slowly, almost imperceptibly, as though moved by some unseen hand, though the air outside was still. The faint, persistent drip of rain outside filled the silence, echoing softly against the wooden boards, a rhythmic percussion that seemed to match the pulsing of the black circle deep inside. The shadows along the floorboards twisted and stretched as if aware of the potential intruder, curling higher, writhing in anticipation, reaching toward the door with subtle, almost liquid movements. The air smelled heavier now, damp and metallic, infused with the lingering presence of the four souls it had claimed, a cold, wet scent that seemed to seep into the lungs of anyone who dared enter. From above, the attic groaned again, slow and deliberate, the faint scratching of claws or nails echoing down the stairs, a patient rhythm that promised observation, calculation, and inevitability. Inside, the circle pulsed with an unnatural light, black yet strangely alive, almost breathing, and the twisted forms of the four trapped souls moved within it, flickering, stretching, their faces frozen in terror and their limbs bent at impossible angles. The whispers began softly at first, curling around the corners of the lodge, insistent and wet, pressing against the ears, entering the mind. Step closer. Step inside. Belong. You cannot resist. Join us. The floorboards groaned as if in response, each creak echoing the pulse of the circle, vibrating through the lodge, moving through the timbers, touching the walls, the ceiling, the air itself, carrying the promise of inevitability. Outside, the wind shifted slightly, carrying a faint rustle of leaves, a sound that seemed almost deliberate, drawing attention to the threshold, to the darkened doorway, to the pulse of the lodge itself. Shadows pooled near the edges of the room, curling toward the entrance, stretching along the walls, growing heavier, more solid, more alive. The lodge seemed to breathe around them, inhaling and exhaling with a rhythm that was alien yet palpable, a heartbeat of hunger and patience, of memory and waiting. The circle pulsed again, a black heart throbbing with quiet authority, drawing the air inward, bending perception, twisting reality in subtle ways. A chair that had been straight now leaned slightly toward the center, a floorboard warped upward, the faint glimmer of something unseen flickering in the corners of vision. The whispers grew louder, almost a chant, an unbroken rhythm pressing into the mind. Step inside. Step closer. Belong. Join us. You cannot resist. The attic groan intensified, heavy and deliberate, accompanied now by a dragging sound, slow and wet, scraping against the wood in a way that made every nerve in the body ache with anticipation and dread. The lodge itself seemed to react, walls bowing subtly, shadows shifting in a deliberate, sentient pattern, all focused on the front door. And then came the first tentative step across the threshold, a foot brushing against the old wooden floor, the sound amplified by the oppressive silence inside. The shadows recoiled for a brief moment, then surged toward the movement, flowing across the floor in liquid darkness, reaching, testing, inviting. The black circle pulsed once more, a silent heartbeat that drew the intruder's attention, weaving its command into their mind even before the door had fully closed. Step closer. Belong. You cannot resist. Step into the darkness. Every fiber of the lodge seemed to respond. Timber and shadow and air conspired to make the interior irresistible, compelling, inevitable. The rain outside continued, soft now, a lullaby masking the true horror inside. As the shadows stretched toward the doorway, the circle pulsed, the whispers swelled, and the lodge waited patiently, knowing it would not be long before the hunger stirred again, claiming another soul to twist, to feed, to bind in the endless pulse of darkness. The intruder's foot hesitated at the threshold, the old wood creaking softly beneath it, each sound magnified in the oppressive silence that had settled over the lodge. The air was thick with dampness and the metallic tang of decay, a scent that seemed to seep into the skin and settle in the chest, pressing on the lungs, filling the mind with unease. Shadows along the floorboards twitched, coiling subtly as if sensing the movement, testing the presence, reaching with invisible tendrils toward the newcomer. Inside, the circle pulsed in slow, deliberate rhythm, a black heart throbbing with life of its own, its glow illuminating the warped, splintered floorboards, the broken furniture, and the grotesque shapes of the four trapped souls within, their faces twisted, eyes wide in eternal terror, limbs bent impossibly. The whispers returned, faint and wet at first, curling around the intruder's thoughts, pressing into their mind with insistent commands. Step closer. You belong. Step into the darkness. You cannot resist. Every instinct screamed to flee, but the pull of the lodge was immediate, subtle yet overwhelming, bending perception, warping reality around the newcomer. The attic groaned overhead, slow and deliberate, the faint scraping of claws or nails tracing along the wood above, announcing the presence of something patient and hungry, something that observed and waited. The shadows responded, writhing toward the intruder, curling along the walls, pooling in corners, reaching in quiet, liquid movements, guiding, enticing, enclosing. The lodge itself seemed alive, every timber, every floorboard, every ceiling beam breathing in rhythm with the black circle, echoing the pulse, vibrating with hunger. Lightning flashed in the distance, momentarily illuminating the darkened windows, revealing glimpses of the forest outside. Wet trunks leaning slightly inward, as if drawn by the pulse of the darkness inside, the rain tapping irregularly against mossy ground. The whispers swelled, now a chorus, pressing into the intruder's mind like wet fingers. Step inside. Join us. Belong. You cannot resist. It waits. It hungers. Step forward. The shadows at the edges of the room shifted in response, stretching, reaching, coiling as though pulling the lodge inward, making the interior impossible to resist, impossible to leave. The first foot moved further inside, creaking against the warped floor, and the shadows surged in response, sliding across the boards toward the intruder, brushing along the edges of their shoes, tugging subtly at their balance, guiding them toward the circle. The circle pulsed again, its black heart throbbing with authority, drawing the intruder's gaze, bending thought, twisting will, making movement toward it inevitable. From above, the attic groan intensified, dragging sounds accompanying it, slow and deliberate, marking time, a patient promise that the lodge would claim all who entered. The whispers now layered over each other, becoming an unbroken chant. Step closer. Step into the darkness. Belong. You cannot resist. Join us. It is waiting. The lodge seemed to lean slightly toward the intruder, floorboards shifting under unseen weight, shadows stretching, coiling around furniture, weaving through cracks in the walls, reaching, inviting, demanding. Every fiber of their being screamed to turn back, but the pull of the circle, the lodge, the darkness itself was irresistible. A second step was taken, then another, until the intruder's whole body crossed the threshold, and the lodge seemed to exhale, welcoming, confirming, preparing. The shadows tightened subtly, guiding, encasing, weaving, pulling inch by inch toward the black pulsing center, while the whispers filled every corner of the mind with promises of inevitability, of surrender, of belonging. And as the intruder's eyes locked on the circle, the black heart pulsing at the lodge's center, the attic above groaned one final time, a deep, wet exhale, as if the building and whatever waited above approved, patient, hungry, eternal. The lodge had claimed its next visitor, and the pulse of the darkness continued, steady, alive, whispering, waiting for the inevitable next movement, the next soul foolish enough to enter. The moment the intruder fully crossed the threshold, the lodge seemed to shift, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, as if the building itself were inhaling, drawing in the presence of the newcomer like a slow, deliberate breath. Shadows along the walls twitched, coiling and stretching, flowing across the warped floorboards toward the pulsing circle at the center of the room, their movements liquid and sentient. The black heart of the circle throbbed rhythmically, a living pulse that seemed to resonate in the bones, in the chest, in the very marrow of anyone within the lodge, calling, pulling, bending perception. The air was thick, heavy with the metallic tang of wet decay, the scent of the 4 previous souls lingering, a suffocating reminder of what awaited. The whispers began again, low at first, curling into the intruder's mind, wet and insistent, pressing against thought. Step closer. You belong. Step into the darkness. You cannot resist. Join us. Every nerve screamed, every instinct shouted to flee, yet the lodge exerted a force beyond comprehension, bending will and perception, making each step forward feel inevitable, almost natural. The attic groaned overhead, slow and deliberate, the faint dragging of claws or nails against old timbers echoing down the stairs, announcing the presence of something immense and patient, observing, waiting, calculating. Shadows responded, sliding up walls, pooling in corners, brushing along furniture, guiding, enclosing, a subtle but irresistible current toward the circle. Lightning flashed far off in the storm-darkened forest, illuminating the gnarled trees that leaned slightly toward the lodge as though drawn to the pulsing black heart within. Rain tapped irregularly on the windows, almost hesitant, a lull masking the true, alive horror inside. The whispers grew, layering upon themselves, a chorus of wet, insistent commands, curling into thought and bone. Step closer. Step into the darkness. Belong. You cannot resist. It waits. It hungers. You cannot leave. The intruder's steps faltered, hesitation flashing across every instinct, but the circle's pull increased, a gravity beyond reason, a force that bent mind and body alike. Shadows surged subtly in response, flowing over the floorboards, brushing along legs, tugging at balance, encouraging forward motion, coiling closer, weaving in and around the intruder's form as though to merge them with the lodge itself. The black circle pulsed again, and with each throb, the shapes of the 4 previous souls flickered faintly within it, faces frozen in terror, limbs bent impossibly, a silent warning and invitation all at once. The attic groan became a scraping rhythm now, a cadence that seemed to echo the pulse of the circle, dragging, patient, deliberate. The lodge responded, walls bending subtly inward, floorboards shifting, shadows tightening, reaching higher, stretching toward the intruder, encasing them in a subtle, living web of darkness that resisted all movement but the direction of the circle. Every heartbeat, every breath, was a battle against inevitability, yet the pull was absolute, relentless. The whispers layered into a single unbroken chant, resonating in bone and skull, in every fiber of being. Step into me. Step into the darkness. You belong. Join us. You cannot resist. The intruder's gaze was drawn to the black heart of the circle, the pulsing void alive with intent, a gravity of malevolent patience, and inch by inch, body and mind bending, they moved forward. The shadows pressed in closer, twisting around limbs, brushing along skin, teasing the line between touch and thought, guiding, claiming, feeding the lodge's hunger. And as the intruder's foot touched the first edge of the circle, the attic groan rose to a deep, wet exhale, a resonance that shook the lodge through every beam, every floorboard, every shadow. The circle pulsed, brighter now, throbbing with absolute authority, and the whispers, loud and wet and undeniable, echoed, "Belong. Step inside. You cannot resist. Join us. It is inevitable." The lodge had awakened fully now, alive and patient, a predator with patience eternal, claiming another soul for its growing collection, shadows twisting and writhing, pulsing with the rhythm of the circle, as the storm outside carried on, indifferent, masking nothing. The moment the intruder stepped fully into the black circle, the lodge seemed to sigh, a long, wet exhalation that reverberated through the warped floorboards, the walls, the ceiling beams. Shadows surged immediately, wrapping around legs and torso with a subtle, irresistible pressure, a liquid-like embrace that felt alive, aware, patient. The black heart of the circle pulsed faster now, a living, throbbing rhythm that resonated in the bones, in the chest, in the very marrow of anyone within reach, compelling, bending, breaking resistance. The air was thick with the metallic tang of wet decay and the faint, lingering scent of the 4 previous souls it had claimed, a suffocating, omnipresent reminder that this was not just a room, but a predator, a trap, a nest of hunger. The whispers returned, wet and insistent, curling inside the intruder's mind with the subtlety of a hand on the shoulder, yet with the force of iron around the skull. You cannot resist. Step closer. You belong. Join us. Step into the darkness. Every instinct screamed to fight, to flee, but the pull of the lodge, of the circle, of the darkness itself, was absolute. Shadows along the walls shifted, pooling in corners, crawling along furniture, reaching, teasing, guiding the intruder inch by inch toward the center. The attic groaned overhead, low and deliberate, scraping and dragging sounds accompanying it, a rhythm of patient menace that made every nerve ache with anticipation. The shapes within the circle flickered faintly, faces frozen in eternal terror, limbs bent impossibly, bodies twisted into grotesque parodies of life, an unspoken warning, a promise of inevitability. Lightning flared briefly in the distant forest, illuminating wet trunks that leaned ever so slightly toward the lodge, the rain tapping against mossy ground with uneven, hesitant rhythms, as though nature itself was aware of the pull emanating from within. The whispers swelled, layering into a relentless chant, pressing through thought, through will into bone. Step closer. Step into the darkness. Belong. You cannot resist. It waits. It hungers. You are mine. The intruder's body trembled, caught between instinct and inevitability, yet the shadows around them tightened subtly, flowing along arms, twisting around legs, encouraging, directing, binding. Every pulse of the black heart drew the intruder closer, bending time and perception, making every step feel both impossible and necessary. The lodge itself responded, walls shifting imperceptibly, floorboards bending under unseen weight, shadows climbing higher, pooling in the corners, weaving together into a subtle living web of darkness, a conduit for the circle's hunger. From above, the attic groan intensified, dragging across wood with wet, deliberate rhythm, echoing the pulse of the circle, marking the inevitability of what was about to unfold. The intruder's mind screamed against the force pressing inward, yet their body moved forward, inch by inch, drawn by a gravity beyond reason, beyond understanding. The circle pulsed again, the black heart glowing brighter, throbbing with absolute authority, a rhythm that matched the lodge's breathing, alive with patience and hunger. Shadows twisted, writhing, coiling around the intruder's form, brushing along skin, pressing against thought, bending will, until every movement but one, the step into the very center, felt impossible to resist. And as the intruder's body finally crossed the final threshold into the center of the black circle, the attic groan rose to a wet, resonant roar, the lodge vibrating in response, every shadow stretching, reaching, merging with the pulsing void, as if the entire building exhaled in approval, patient, eternal, satisfied for the moment, yet already waiting, always waiting for the next. As the intruder's body settled into the center of the black circle, a deep, vibrating pulse rippled outward, shaking the warped floorboards, rattling the walls, and sending a subtle tremor through the ceiling beams. Shadows surged immediately, curling and twisting around the intruder's limbs with liquid-like precision, binding tightly, but not violently, as if guiding rather than restraining, an inescapable current of dark intent. The lodge itself seemed alive now, every timber and plank responding to the black heart at its center, moving imperceptibly, leaning inward, amplifying the oppressive weight of the darkness that pulsed at the intruder's feet. The four previous souls flickered faintly within the circle, their twisted, elongated forms a grotesque reflection of terror, faces frozen in silent screams, limbs bent beyond natural limits, eyes wide with an eternal horror. The whispers returned in a steady, wet rhythm, curling through the intruder's mind like thick fog, pressing insistently against every thought. Step into me. You belong. You cannot resist. Join us. It hungers. You are mine. Each pulse of the circle reverberated like a heartbeat, carrying not just force but intent, bending the intruder's perception, slowing time, stretching each second into eternity. The air grew heavier, thick with the metallic scent of decay, damp wood, and something older, something that smelled of stone and soil turned over after long centuries. The attic groaned overhead, slow and deliberate, claws or nails scraping along the old timbers, dragging, testing, observing. Shadows along the walls responded, rising, stretching toward the ceiling, pooling in corners, weaving through furniture, forming subtle, almost imperceptible shapes that mimicked movement, reaching for the intruder with patient precision. Lightning flashed across the distant forest, illuminating wet, gnarled trunks leaning slightly toward the lodge, as though drawn to the black heart, the pulse of the circle, and the intruder within it. Rain tapped irregularly against the windows, masking nothing, carrying the sense of suspended time, a lull that only heightened the awareness of what was inside. The whispers grew louder, forming a chorus now, pressing into the intruder's thoughts and bones alike. You cannot leave. You cannot resist. Step into the darkness. Join us. You belong. You are mine. Every muscle in the intruder's body resisted, trembled, fought, yet the pull was absolute, the shadows tightening subtly, twisting around legs and arms, brushing along skin, guiding inch by inch, bending will, erasing resistance. The circle pulsed faster now, the black heart glowing brighter, throbbing with intent, alive with a malevolent patience that had no end. The lodge groaned, walls bending slightly inward, floorboards quivering, shadows stretching higher, forming a living web of darkness around the intruder. And then the whispering changed, growing intimate, wet and cold, sliding into thought like a physical touch. I remember all who have come before. I remember. I wait. I hunger. And now you belong to me. The pulse of the circle intensified, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to shake the air itself, pressing the intruder fully into the center, merging them with the lodge, the shadows, and the black heart, a slow, inexorable claim that left no space for resistance. The attic groan rose to a wet, resonant roar, as if the entire building was exhaling, approving, satisfied for the moment, but patient, eternal, already aware that it would hunger again, waiting for the next visitor foolish enough to cross the threshold into the lodge's embrace. The intruder's body shivered as the shadows tightened fully around them, a slick, living pressure that seemed to seep into the very bones, binding mind and body together with the black pulse of the circle. The lodge trembled subtly under the strain, walls bending inward, floorboards quivering with the rhythm of a heartbeat not human, not natural, but ancient, patient, eternal. The black heart of the circle throbbed steadily, sending waves of force through the air, twisting perception, slowing thought, bending time into an endless stretch of inevitability. The shapes of the four previous souls flickered within the circle, their elongated, grotesque forms twisting and writhing, faces frozen in silent terror, limbs bent impossibly, eyes wide, reflecting the pulsing glow of the black heart. The whispers returned, wet and curling, layering over each other into a steady, inescapable rhythm that invaded the intruder's mind. Step further. Belong. You cannot resist. Join us. You are mine. All will belong. Every fiber of the intruder's body screamed to fight, to flee, yet each breath, each movement, was guided, inevitable, drawn forward by the invisible pull of the lodge itself. The attic groaned overhead, slow and deliberate, the dragging of claws or nails against the old wood echoing down the stairs, marking the presence of something patient, something immense, watching, calculating. Shadows along the walls reacted, stretching and twisting, pooling in corners, sliding over furniture, brushing along the intruder, tugging subtly, a silent command they could not resist. Lightning flashed far in the storm-darkened forest, illuminating the wet, gnarled trees that leaned slightly toward the lodge, their reflection mirrored in the darkened windows, while the rain tapped irregularly on mossy earth, masking nothing, serving only as a lullaby for the darkness inside. The whispers grew louder, merging into a single, wet, unbroken chant that pressed into bone, thought, and soul. You cannot leave. You cannot resist. You are mine. Step into the darkness. Join us. Belong. The intruder's head spun, vision narrowing, mind bending, reality twisting as the circle's pulse intensified, each throb pulling them deeper, merging body with shadow, thought with whisper, existence with the lodge's living hunger. The shadows around them thickened, coiling higher, wrapping tighter, pressing against every limb, every thought, until the intruder could feel themselves dissolve slightly into the darkness, becoming part of the web of the lodge, part of the pulse, part of the black heart that had claimed countless before. The lodge itself seemed to breathe in response, walls bowing subtly, floorboards quivering, shadows climbing toward the ceiling, forming a living cocoon that held the intruder immobile but somehow drawn, compelled, fully absorbed by the will of the darkness. Then, from somewhere deep above in the attic, the groan intensified into a dragging, wet roar echoing through every timber, every floorboard, every shadow, a resonance that confirmed the claim, the hunger satisfied momentarily, the patience eternal. The black heart pulsed faster now, thrumming through the intruder, merging shadow and flesh, mind and thought, erasing resistance, imprinting inevitability. Belong. Step into me. You are mine. Join us. All will belong. Outside, the forest remained silent, rain dripping softly against the windows, storm distant and indifferent, while the lodge throbbed with life, alive with hunger, patient, eternal, waiting, and already anticipating the next soul foolish enough to enter its pulsing, black embrace. The intruder's body was fully absorbed now, a slick, living pressure of shadow and darkness merging with the black circle at the lodge's center. Time no longer had meaning. Seconds stretched into eternity, and the pulse of the black heart became the only measure of existence. The lodge itself seemed to lean inward, walls bowing subtly, floorboards vibrating with the rhythm of a heartbeat not human but older, hungrier, eternal. The four previous souls flickered within the circle, their grotesque, elongated forms twisting and writhing, faces frozen in terror, limbs bent impossibly, their eyes reflecting the pulsing black-red glow of the heart, a silent, eternal warning and confirmation of the lodge's power. Whispers filled every corner of the intruder's mind, wet and insistent, curling like smoke through thought, merging with perception. You belong. You cannot resist. Step into the darkness. Join us. All will belong. The lodge remembers. The lodge waits. Every breath the intruder took was borrowed, every movement guided, every thought bending under the relentless gravity of the circle. The shadows responded, thickening, coiling, wrapping around walls, ceiling beams, furniture, creating a living web of darkness that pressed in from all sides, seamless and absolute. The attic groaned above, slow, deliberate, dragging sounds of nails or claws scraping the timbers echoing throughout the lodge, marking the presence of something patient, observing, eternal. Lightning flared in the distant forest, briefly illuminating twisted, wet trunks leaning slightly toward the lodge, and in that flash, the windows reflected not just the outside but the pulse within, shadows stretching outward, reaching, claiming, waiting for the inevitable. The black heart pulsed faster now, a living rhythm that resonated through bone, marrow, and mind, bending the intruder into the will of the lodge, drawing them fully into the darkness. The whispers layered into a chorus, inescapable, pressing on thought, on will, on reality itself. All will belong. Step into me. You cannot resist. Join us. You are mine. The intruder could no longer distinguish self from shadow, body from the circle, mind from the whispers. Every part of them dissolved into the lodge's hunger, becoming part of its pulse, part of its living memory, part of the eternal waiting. Outside, the rain fell softly, masking the horror within, the storm indifferent, while the lodge throbbed, alive and patient, a predator in the quiet forest, waiting for the next visitor foolish enough to approach. The shadows twisted and pulsed around the black heart, now filled with countless echoes of terror, past and present, merging the intruder with those who had come before, a living, writhing testament to inevitability. The whispers swelled one last time, wet, insistent, absolute, echoing in every corner of the mind. Belong. You cannot resist. All will belong. The lodge waits. Always. Eternally. And then, as though the building itself exhaled, a heavy, wet, resonant sound filled the air, vibrating through every beam, every floorboard, every shadow, confirming the claim, imprinting the darkness permanently into the lodge's pulse. The intruder, like all who had come before, had become part of it, part of the black heart, part of the living shadows, part of the whispers, absorbed completely into the lodge's eternal hunger. Outside, the forest remained quiet, the rain a soft lullaby masking the unending presence inside. The lodge sat dark and patient, pulsing gently, waiting, alive, eternal, ready for the next who would dare to cross its threshold, ready to pull them into the same inevitable embrace, the same unending pulse of darkness and hunger, for nothing had ended and nothing ever would. Even as the lodge seemed to settle into an uneasy calm, the black heart at its center continued to pulse faintly, a subtle but undeniable rhythm that suggested the hunger within had only paused, not ended. The shadows along the walls twisted faintly, curling like smoke around the edges of broken furniture, reaching toward the ceiling and floorboards as if tasting the air for the next presence, waiting patiently. Outside, the forest was drenched in mist, rain dripping slowly from gnarled branches, each drop falling into puddles that reflected nothing but darkness, masking the pulse of the lodge within. The whispers, though quieter now, had not disappeared. They lingered in corners of thought, wet and insistent, echoing softly as if carried through every floorboard and beam. It waits. Always. You cannot resist. Belong. The air smelled of wet earth, decay, and something older, more alien, a scent that seemed to seep into the very bones of the forest and the lodge alike. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating twisted tree trunks that appeared to lean subtly toward the lodge, casting long, shifting shadows that mirrored the black heart's pulsing rhythm inside. The attic groaned faintly, the scraping of claws or nails against the old wood slow and deliberate, a constant reminder that something immense and patient remained above, observing, waiting. Occasionally, the floorboards would creak on their own, small, subtle shifts that suggested movement, though no one could be seen. The black circle, though it no longer contained the intruder from part 25, pulsed faintly as if maintaining memory of every soul it had claimed, every whisper that had been spoken, every twitch of shadow that had drawn another inside. Outside, the forest seemed alive with a quiet tension, the soft patter of rain masking sounds that might have been branches moving under unseen weight, or perhaps the gentle shift of earth as something waited beneath the soil, patient, hungry, eternal. Occasionally, the lodge's windows would glint faintly with black reflection, as if the darkness inside had extended itself, observing the forest beyond, feeling, remembering, anticipating. The whispers grew occasionally, wet and curling around thought like smoke, always suggesting, always hinting, "It comes again. You cannot resist. All will belong." Inside, the shadows pulsed faintly, twisting against each other, stretching toward the ceiling and then collapsing back toward the black circle as though rehearsing for the next arrival. Every plank, every crevice of the lodge, seemed saturated with the memory of what had transpired, every scream, every struggle, every sigh of inevitability preserved in the air, ready to awaken once more. And deep within the black heart, the faintest pulse hinted that it had not forgotten the intruder, that the lodge itself remembered and waited, patient beyond comprehension, eternal, holding the promise that all who entered would eventually succumb, joining the endless rhythm of darkness and whispers, the same inevitability that had claimed all before. Even as the rain continued softly, masking the forest in its misty embrace, the lodge pulsed with life, unseen but unmistakable, alive with hunger and patience, waiting silently for the next footstep to cross its threshold. The lodge sat in silence, yet that silence was thick, heavy, almost alive, like a veil stretched over the forest that muted sound while amplifying the pulse from within. The black heart at the center continued to beat softly, an eternal rhythm that seemed to vibrate through every timber, every floorboard, every shadowed corner. Shadows along the walls twitched, coiling and stretching as if breathing, moving with a life of their own, subtly testing the boundaries of the lodge, reaching toward empty spaces where no one yet stood. Outside, the rain fell steadily, soft and uneven, each drop striking the roof and windows with a hollow metallic sound that echoed faintly into the forest beyond, masking the subtle creaks, groans, and whispers that emerged from the lodge itself. The air smelled damp and metallic, with undertones of wet earth and decay, and something older, an alien scent that seemed to belong to neither the forest nor the lodge, but to the darkness within. The attic groaned above, dragging nails or claws slowly across the timbers, a deliberate rhythm that spoke of patient observation, a presence immense and hidden, waiting for the inevitable return of motion below. Occasionally, floorboards creaked on their own, subtle shifts that seemed to suggest footsteps, though no one could be seen, and the shadows responded, twisting and pooling, stretching toward imagined shapes, as if anticipating the next arrival. The whispers returned in faint threads, curling around invisible edges, insinuating themselves into thought. "It waits. You cannot resist. Belong. Join us. All will belong." Inside, the black circle pulsed faintly, alive with the memory of every soul it had claimed, every scream, every struggle, every motion of fear, preserved as a rhythm and a gravity, calling silently to the forest beyond. Lightning flared far in the storm-darkened forest, briefly illuminating gnarled, wet trees that leaned subtly toward the lodge, casting long shifting shadows that seemed to breathe, to move in time with the black heart. Shadows inside coiled and stretched in subtle waves, crawling over furniture, pooling in corners, brushing against the floorboards as if rehearsing their roles, preparing for another inevitable arrival. The whispers grew slowly, wet and curling around thought, layering into a soft, insistent chant that pressed on every nerve. "Step closer. You cannot resist. All will belong. The lodge remembers. It waits. You are mine." Even in apparent calm, the lodge was alive with anticipation, a predator stretching its limbs in the quiet, its hunger dormant but patient, eternal. And somewhere deep within the black heart, a pulse suggested memory and awareness, the faint echo of the intruder absorbed in part 25 still resonating, mingling with the countless others before, a living rhythm that reinforced the lodge's inevitability. Outside, the forest remained misted and quiet, rain dripping softly into puddles that reflected only darkness, masking the lodge's presence, yet unable to hide the subtle movement of shadow through window panes, or the faint pull of its gravity, reaching into the world beyond. And beneath the quiet, beneath the drizzle, beneath the night itself, the lodge breathed, patient, waiting, eternal, alive with whispers and shadows, ready for the next who would dare cross its threshold, promising the same inescapable embrace, the same pulse of darkness, the same inevitability. The night deepened over the rain-soaked forest, and the lodge sat in patient stillness, though stillness here was an illusion. Every timber, every floorboard, every shadow seemed alive with quiet anticipation, pulsing in time with the black heart at the center, the eternal core of the lodge's hunger. The black circle's pulse was faint but insistent, radiating a gravity that bent perception, making the lodge seem larger, older, more alive than any natural building could be. Shadows along the walls moved subtly, coiling and stretching like smoke, slipping into corners and along beams, brushing over furniture and floorboards as if practicing for a moment yet to come. The attic groaned above, slow and deliberate, nails or claws scraping the old wood with wet, echoing rhythm, a sound that resonated through the lodge's frame, carrying a promise of observation, of patient calculation. The rain outside fell unevenly, each drop a soft percussion against the roof and windows, masking the quieter sounds inside. Floorboards shifting, shadows writhing, faint whispers curling into thought. The air inside the lodge smelled damp, metallic and ancient, a mix of wet earth, decay, and something unplaceable older than the forest itself. From the circle, faint glimpses of the souls it had claimed flickered in twisted shapes, faces frozen in terror, limbs bent impossibly, their presence woven into the lodge's memory, feeding the pulse, reinforcing the inevitability of what it demanded. The whispers, wet and curling, threaded through the intruder's imagination and the empty lodge alike. It waits. All will belong. You cannot resist. Join us. Step closer. Belong. Every creak, every groan, every subtle shift of shadow was amplified by the lodge's awareness, a sentient patience that stretched through time, waiting for the next intruder, the next curious soul, the next footstep to break the threshold. Lightning flared in the distant storm, briefly illuminating the forest outside, twisted trunks bending subtly toward the lodge, reflections in the windows hinting at the black heart's pulse within, the shadows moving as if synchronized with the storm. The shadows inside thickened, flowing like liquid toward the center, brushing and coiling, an intricate web that waited for motion, guiding, enclosing, preparing. The whispers grew into a layered, unbroken hum of inevitability. Step inside. Belong. You cannot resist. Join us. It hungers. You are mine. All will belong. Every element of the lodge participated, the walls, the floors, the ceiling beams, the shadows themselves, a living organism patient and eternal. And beneath it all, the black heart pulsed steadily, quietly, holding memory and intent, its influence stretching beyond the room, beyond the lodge, into the misted forest itself, reaching, waiting, reminding the world that the lodge was alive, hungry, and eternal. Rain fell softly, masking the forest, and yet no matter the quiet, the lodge's pulse, the shadows, and the whispers persisted, patient, ever present, waiting for the next who would dare approach, promising the inevitable. Absorption, surrender, and eternal belonging to the darkness at its center. The lodge had settled into a silence that was anything but empty. Its walls seemed to breathe in time with the black heart at the center, a slow, relentless pulse that stretched into every floorboard, every beam, every shadowed corner. The black circle throbbed faintly, alive with memory, alive with intent, carrying the weight of every soul it had claimed, including the intruder from Part 25, whose presence still lingered like an echo within the shadows. The air smelled damp, metallic, and ancient, as though centuries of rain, decay, and whispered terror had seeped into the wood itself, saturating it, making every inhalation heavy, unavoidable. Shadows along the walls moved subtly, coiling, stretching, slipping along the floorboards and across furniture, a silent, patient anticipation that seemed to pulse along with the lodge itself. Outside, the rain fell steadily, irregularly, each drop tapping the roof, the windows, and the forest floor with a hollow, metallic sound, masking the creaks, groans, and subtle movements of the lodge's interior. The attic groaned low and deliberate, the dragging of nails or claws echoing down the staircases and through the walls, announcing a presence patient, immense, and eternal, ever watchful. The whispers curled through every corner, threading through the intruder's memories and into the empty lodge alike, wet and insistent. It waits. You cannot resist. All will belong. Step inside. Join us. You are mine. The black heart pulsed faster, subtle at first, then with more insistence, sending vibrations through every plank and shadow, bending perception, slowing thought, twisting reality until the lodge itself became impossible to separate from the darkness within. The four previous souls flickered faintly in twisted, grotesque shapes within the circle, faces frozen in terror, limbs bent beyond natural limits, their presence woven into the lodge's memory, feeding the pulse, reinforcing the inevitability of absorption. The shadows thickened, coiling around furniture, crawling along floorboards, brushing lightly against walls as if testing the air for motion, for life, for a footstep to claim. Lightning flared far off in the storm-darkened forest, briefly illuminating twisted, wet trees that leaned subtly toward the lodge, their reflections in the windows blending with the shadows inside, merging forest and lodge into a single breathing darkness. The whispers intensified, layering into a single unbroken chant that pressed on thought, bone and mind. Step closer. You cannot resist. All will belong. The lodge remembers. It waits. You are mine. It hungers. Every creak, every groan, every flicker of shadow responded in perfect harmony with the black heart, a living rhythm that reinforced the inevitability of surrender. The attic groan rose, dragging across the old timbers in a wet, resonant roar, echoing through the lodge's frame, signaling that the building had fully awakened, fully alive, fully patient. Even as the rain masked the forest in mist and quiet, the lodge pulsed with an eternal living hunger, aware of its own power, remembering every soul, preparing for the next footstep that would cross the threshold, promising the same inescapable embrace, the same absorption into shadows, the same surrender to the black heart at its center. The lodge waited patiently, the pulse of the black heart steady, eternal, unyielding, alive with memory and hunger, ready to claim again, always waiting, always patient, always inevitable. The final night fell heavy over the forest, rain drumming steadily against the lodge's roof, each drop a muted percussion that seemed to sync subtly with the faint pulse of the black heart at the center. Inside, the lodge was alive in ways that could not be seen, only felt, a sentient presence that breathed through every timber, floorboard, and shadow, patient, eternal, hungry. The black circle at the center throbbed steadily, a living, breathing rhythm that resonated through bone, flesh, and thought, carrying the memory of every soul it had claimed, including the intruder from Part 25, merging the past with the present, a tapestry of inevitability. Shadows along the walls writhed subtly, stretching and curling like smoke, pooling in corners, slipping over furniture, brushing along floorboards, moving with a quiet intelligence, as if preparing for yet another arrival. The attic groaned above, the dragging of nails or claws along the timbers slow, deliberate, resonant, announcing that whatever waited there remained patient, immense, and eternal, observing every motion within and beyond the lodge. The whispers threaded through the lodge like wet, curling fingers, insistent, omnipresent, reaching into the mind of anyone who approached, speaking not words but inevitability. It waits. You cannot resist. Step inside. Join us. All will belong. Belong. The black heart pulsed faster now, a subtle increase in rhythm that vibrated through the walls, shadows, and floorboards, bending perception, slowing thought, twisting reality, and merging it with the darkness at the lodge's core. The four previous souls flickered faintly, grotesque forms frozen in eternal terror, limbs bent impossibly, faces fixed in silent screams, reminders of inevitability and the lodge's absolute power. Outside, the storm raged softly, lightning briefly illuminating the wet forest, twisted trees leaning slightly toward the lodge as if drawn to its pulse, rain masking the whispers that reached into the woods, carrying the lodge's hunger further than its walls. Shadows inside thickened, coiling around corners, wrapping furniture, brushing along walls, preparing, anticipating, moving in a subtle choreography with the black heart, waiting for a footstep, a presence, a curious soul to cross the threshold. The whispers layered into a constant, insistent hum, pressing into bone, mind, and thought. Step closer. You cannot resist. Join us. All will belong. The lodge remembers. It waits. You are mine. It hungers. Every part of the lodge participated. The walls, the floor, the ceiling beams, the shadows, the very air, alive with patient, eternal hunger. Deep within the black heart, the pulse continued, holding memory, intent, and expectation. A living rhythm that extended beyond the lodge itself into the misted forest, reaching, waiting, drawing attention with a gravity impossible to resist. The attic groan rose to a wet, resonant roar, echoing through every timber, every floorboard, every shadow, a final affirmation of life, of patience, of inevitability. The lodge exhaled in quiet triumph, pulsing with an eternal rhythm, a living darkness that absorbed and remembered, always waiting for the next footstep to cross its threshold. Outside, rain fell softly, masking the forest in mist and quiet, but the lodge remained alive, alive with shadows, whispers, and pulse, patient, eternal, and hungry, the ultimate predator of the forest, the keeper of its own black heart, ready for all who would dare enter, for nothing had ended, nothing ever would, and all would belong. The forest outside had grown darker, heavier, the mist thickening as though the storm itself was being drawn toward the lodge. Rain fell steadily, drumming against the roof and windows in irregular rhythms, each drop masking a subtle creak, a whisper, a movement inside. The lodge pulsed faintly, its black heart beating slower now, a patient, deliberate rhythm that seemed to stretch through every floorboard, every beam, every shadowed corner. The shadows along the walls were restless, curling and twisting like living smoke, reaching toward each other, brushing furniture, coiling around corners, testing, stretching, waiting. The whispers had returned, faint but insistent, curling through thought. It waits. You cannot resist. All will belong. Step inside. Join us. Belong. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, metallic decay, and something ancient, something that had always existed alongside the forest and the lodge, older than the rain, older than the mist. The attic groaned slowly above, the scraping of nails or claws deliberate and measured, a sound that carried through every timber, announcing the presence of something immense, patient, and eternal. Lightning flashed far off, briefly illuminating the twisted, wet trees that leaned subtly toward the lodge as if aware of the black heart's pulse within. Shadows inside seemed to respond, coiling tighter, brushing lightly along floorboards and walls, flowing in subtle currents that guided invisible paths, waiting, preparing. The black heart throbbed faintly, its pulse carrying memory and intent, echoing through the lodge and beyond, touching the misted forest outside, whispering in ways the storm could not drown. Step closer. You cannot resist. All will belong. Join us. You are mine. The lodge itself breathed, a living organism of timber, shadow, and darkness, alive with patient, eternal hunger, waiting for the next step that would cross its threshold. The circle at the center, though empty, pulsed with memory, carrying the echoes of all who had entered, a rhythm of inevitability that whispered through walls, shadows, and floorboards alike. Every creak, every subtle shift, every flicker of shadow was alive with intent, rehearsing for the next presence, preparing, ensuring that all who came would feel the same pull, the same inevitability, the same surrender to the lodge's black heart. Outside, the forest remained misted and quiet, but within, the lodge thrummed with life, patient, eternal, and hungry, a predator cloaked in timber, shadow, and whisper, waiting for the next who would dare enter, promising absorption, surrender, and eternity. The lodge seemed to breathe as night pressed deeper into the forest, each exhale of shadow and pulse of the black heart carrying a silent, insistent command. Rain drummed unevenly on the roof, each drop amplifying the lodge's pulse, vibrating through timber and floorboards, echoing along walls and through the cracks of shadow. The air smelled damp, metallic, and older than memory itself, heavy with the scent of wet earth, moss, and a subtle tang of decay that clung to the lodge like a second skin. Shadows along the walls writhed and stretched as if alive, flowing over furniture and floorboards, pooling in corners, creeping upward toward the ceiling beams, a patient, meticulous choreography of darkness. The attic groaned above, nails or claws dragging across timbers slowly, deliberately, a sound that resonated through the lodge and whispered to the forest outside. The lodge remembered, it observed, it waited. The black heart at the center pulsed faintly, carrying memory, echoes of every soul it had claimed, every whisper it had spoken, every struggle it had absorbed, layering them into a rhythm that reached even into the misted forest beyond. Lightning flared distantly, illuminating wet, twisted trunks that leaned slightly toward the lodge, reflections in the windows merging with the shadows inside, blending the forest and the lodge into a single, breathing darkness. Whispers curled through every corner of the lodge, wet and insistent. It waits. You cannot resist. Step inside. All will belong. Join us. You are mine. The shadows thickened, wrapping corners, furniture, and beams, brushing along walls and floorboards, coiling with patient intelligence, as if anticipating the next footstep that would break the threshold. The black circle at the center throbbed with subtle insistence, alive with memory, carrying the pulse of the lodge forward, a gravity that bent perception and twisted reality around it. Floorboards creaked faintly in empty spaces, a suggestion of movement, and the shadows responded immediately, coiling and stretching to fill imagined spaces, guiding, absorbing, preparing. The lodge pulsed with life, a living predator of timber, shadow, and blackened intent, patient and eternal, waiting for the inevitable curiosity of the next soul. The whispers grew into a layered, constant hum that vibrated through walls, floorboards, ceiling beams, and shadows. Step closer. You cannot resist. All will belong. The lodge remembers. It waits. You are mine. It hungers. Outside, the storm continued, but the lodge's pulse dominated, a quiet, eternal rhythm of hunger and inevitability, reaching into the forest, reminding the world that it existed, that it was alive, that it waited. And somewhere deep within the black heart, the faintest echo of those absorbed remained, resonating with every pulse, every whisper, every shadow, merging past and present into a single, unending, patient hunger. The forest beyond the lodge had become a haze of mist and rain, the storm whispering against the gnarled trees, bending branches as if to peer closer at the structure that pulsed with its own life. Inside, the lodge's heartbeat, the black heart's steady, omnipresent pulse, seemed to dominate every sound, every shadow, every breath of air. Shadows along the walls twisted and writhed, pooling in corners, stretching over floorboards and furniture, coiling upward toward the ceiling, alive with patient, deliberate intent. The attic groaned above, the dragging of nails or claws along timbers deliberate and wet, echoing downward, vibrating through every beam and floorboard, a constant, subtle reminder that the lodge watched, remembered, and waited. The black circle at the center glimmered faintly, pulsing with the memory of every soul it had absorbed, every whisper it had forced into submission, every motion of terror, every futile struggle. It was alive not just with hunger, but with intelligence, with intent. The air was thick, damp, and metallic, heavy with the scent of wet earth, old decay, and something ancient, a presence older than the forest itself. Whispers returned, wet and curling through empty corners and into the mind, layering into a constant hum of inevitability. You cannot resist. Step inside. All will belong. Join us. Belong. It waits. You are mine. Floorboards creaked faintly, subtle, almost imperceptible, yet the shadows responded instantly, coiling tighter, brushing against walls, over furniture, pooling along the edges of the lodge, moving in anticipation. Lightning flashed far in the forest, briefly illuminating twisted, wet trunks that leaned toward the lodge, their reflections merging with the shadows inside, blurring the line between what was inside and outside, between forest and darkness. The black heart pulsed faster now, a living rhythm that pressed through bone, marrow, and mind, bending perception, slowing thought, drawing all who entered into its patient orbit. The lodge itself seemed to breathe in tandem with the pulse, expanding imperceptibly, stretching its shadows, filling every corner with subtle movement, a choreography of predatory patience. Whispers layered and overlapped into a wet, insistent chant. Step closer. You cannot resist. All will belong. The lodge remembers. It waits. It hungers. You are mine. Every element of the lodge, walls, floorboards, beams, shadows, even the air itself, was alive, aware, patient, stretching into the forest outside, merging rain, mist, and darkened trees with the inescapable pulse of the black heart. Floorboards shifted, furniture seemed to lean subtly, shadows reached in imperceptible currents toward every corner, as if rehearsing, preparing for the next footstep, the next curious soul who would cross the threshold. And somewhere deep within the black heart, the faintest echoes of the absorbed intruders pulsed gently, resonating with the lodge's eternal hunger, a memory and a promise, carrying forward the inevitability that no one could resist for long, that all would eventually belong, that the lodge would wait forever, patient, eternal, and hungry. Night had fallen completely over the forest, the rain falling in heavy, irregular drops that struck the lodge's roof and windows with a rhythm both chaotic and hypnotic, masking the subtle sounds of movement inside. The black heart at the center pulsed steadily, its rhythm a living, breathing presence that seemed to stretch through every floorboard, every timber, every shadow, binding them together with a quiet, patient hunger. Shadows along the walls writhed and coiled, flowing over furniture, pooling in corners, climbing along beams, and brushing the floorboards in deliberate, practiced currents, alive with subtle intelligence and intent. The attic groaned overhead, nails or claws scraping slowly along timbers in wet, echoing rhythms, reverberating through every part of the lodge, a reminder that the presence above was immense, patient, eternal, and ever watchful. The black circle glimmered faintly, alive with the memory of every soul it had claimed, the echo of terror, struggle, and surrender imprinted into its pulse, reinforcing the inevitability that anyone who crossed the threshold would eventually succumb. The air inside smelled damp, metallic, earthy, and ancient, saturated with decay, wet wood, and a subtle alien scent that seemed to belong not to the forest, not to the lodge, but to the darkness within. Whispers threaded through every corner of thought and shadow, curling wet and insistent into consciousness, soft but inescapable. It waits. You cannot resist. All will belong. Step inside. Join us. Belong. You are mine. Floorboards shifted ever so slightly, as though in anticipation, and the shadows responded immediately, coiling tighter, moving along walls and corners, brushing over furniture and beams, rehearsing for the inevitable motion of the next visitor. Lightning flared in the distance, briefly illuminating the twisted, wet trunks of the forest trees that leaned subtly toward the lodge, their reflections merging with the shadows inside, blurring the line between interior and exterior, forest and darkness. The black heart pulsed faster now, vibrating through bone, mind, and marrow, bending perception, slowing thought, drawing all who came near into its patient, inevitable orbit. The lodge itself seemed to breathe, expanding subtly with each pulse, stretching its shadows to fill every corner, a living, predatory organism, patient and eternal. Whispers grew into a layered, unbroken chant. Step closer. You cannot resist. All will belong. The lodge remembers. It waits. It hungers. You are mine. Every part of the lodge, walls, floorboards, beams, shadows, even the air itself, was alive, aware, patient, extending into the forest, merging rain, mist, and darkened trees with the inescapable pulse of the black heart. Somewhere deep within, echoes of past intruders pulsed gently in resonance with the lodge's eternal hunger, a memory, a warning, a promise. Inevitability, absorption, surrender, and belonging. Outside, the forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting, the rain masking the pulse, but unable to hide it, for the lodge was alive, patient, eternal, hungry, and waiting for the next who would dare cross its threshold. The storm outside intensified slightly, rain lashing the roof and windows with sudden, irregular force, each drop a staccato percussion that echoed through the lodge and against the surrounding forest. Yet within, the lodge's own rhythm, the pulse of the black heart, dominated every sound, subtle but insistent, stretching through timber, floorboards, and shadows, a living heartbeat of hunger and anticipation. Shadows along the walls twisted and coiled with deliberate intent, flowing over furniture, pooling in corners, crawling along beams, brushing floorboards as if aware of every breath, every thought, every movement. The attic groaned above, nails or claws dragging across timbers slowly, deliberately, echoing through every part of the lodge, a constant reminder that the presence there was immense, patient, eternal, and observant. The black circle at the center pulsed faintly, carrying the memory of every soul it had claimed, their terror, their resistance, their surrender woven into the lodge itself, reinforcing inevitability, a gravity that bent perception and slowed thought. The air inside smelled of damp wood, wet earth, metallic decay, and something older, something alien, a scent that seemed to exist alongside the forest yet entirely separate, belonging to the darkness inside. Whispers curled through every corner, threading into thought and shadow alike, wet and insistent. Step closer. You cannot resist. All will belong. Join us. Belong. The lodge remembers. It waits. You are mine. The shadows thickened, coiling and stretching, brushing corners, walls, and beams, moving with a subtle intelligence, rehearsing the choreography of anticipation, preparing for the inevitable arrival of a curious footstep. Lightning flared far off, briefly illuminating twisted, wet trunks leaning toward the lodge, their reflections merging with the shadows inside, blurring boundaries between forest and interior, outside and within, reality and the blackened pull of the lodge. The pulse of the black heart grew slightly faster, vibrating through bone and marrow, embedding a rhythm in the mind that bent perception and compressed time, drawing all who approached toward inevitable absorption. The lodge itself seemed alive in ways impossible to quantify, expanding imperceptibly, stretching shadows, filling corners, a predator of timber, darkness, and whisper, patient, eternal, hungry. Whispers layered over one another into an unbroken, wet chant. You cannot resist. Step inside. All will belong. Join us. The lodge waits. It hungers. You are mine. The pulse resonated beyond walls and windows, stretching into the misted forest outside, touching tree trunks, puddles, earth, and air, announcing existence, life, and a patient hunger that would not relent. And deep within the black heart, echoes of past intruders pulsed, resonating with the lodge's eternal rhythm, an unending, patient, inevitable hunger that promised absorption, surrender, and belonging to all who dared approach. The forest outside may have seemed quiet, misted, and distant, but the lodge throbbed with life, ready, waiting, eternal, a predator poised to claim the next footstep that crossed its threshold. The forest had grown denser in the darkness, mist curling between twisted trunks, rain falling in endless, uneven patterns, muffling distant sounds while intensifying the lodge's own heartbeat, the black heart at its center. Inside, every floorboard, every timber, every shadow vibrated with subtle awareness, a quiet intelligence that waited and watched with unbroken patience. Shadows along the walls writhed like smoke, stretching over furniture, pooling in corners, crawling along beams, brushing floorboards in deliberate, fluid motions, alive with anticipation, as if rehearsing for the inevitable arrival. The attic groaned above, nails or claws dragging slowly across timbers, wet and deliberate, echoing downward, a low, resonant sound that reverberated through the lodge, announcing the presence of something immense, patient, eternal, always observing. The black circle at the center throbbed faintly, carrying the memory of every soul it had claimed, the echoes of fear, resistance, and surrender layered into its rhythm, a pulse that bent perception, slowed thought, and drew all who entered toward inevitable absorption. The air smelled of damp wood, wet earth, metallic decay, and something older, alien, a presence that had existed longer than the forest itself, a darkness that could not be named. Whispers threaded through every corner, curling like smoke around walls and floorboards, wet, insistent, omnipresent. It waits. You cannot resist. Step inside. All will belong. Join us. Belong. You are mine. Lightning flared far away, illuminating twisted, dripping trunks that leaned toward the lodge, their reflections in the windows merging with shadows inside, blending exterior and interior, forest and lodge, the world and the darkness within. Shadows thickened, flowing along walls, beams, and corners, brushing furniture, coiling with deliberate intelligence, moving in anticipation of the next footstep, the next soul to test the gravity of the lodge's pulse. The black heart pulsed stronger now, vibrations reaching bone and marrow, embedding an unrelenting rhythm in perception, bending thought and drawing the world closer to its inevitability. The lodge seemed to breathe, expanding subtly, stretching its shadows, filling every corner with its patient, predatory presence. Whispers layered into a constant, wet chant. Step closer. You cannot resist. All will belong. The lodge remembers. It waits. It hungers. You are mine. Every wall, floorboard, beam, shadow, and breath of air was alive, aware, reaching outward, touching the forest beyond, pulling mist, rain, and trees into the same rhythm. Deep within the black heart, faint echoes of absorbed intruders pulsed alongside the lodge's own eternal heartbeat, a memory and a warning, an inevitability made flesh and shadow, promising surrender, absorption, and eternal belonging. Outside, the rain fell softly, mist curled through the trees, and the lodge throbbed in quiet triumph, patient, eternal, alive, and waiting for the next who would dare cross its threshold. The rain had slowed to a persistent drizzle, yet the mist in the forest had thickened, curling through gnarled trunks, weaving between roots and puddles, shrouding the lodge in a gray, unbroken veil. Yet the lodge itself throbbed with life, a presence both patient and eternal, every timber, floorboard, and shadow vibrating subtly in time with the black heart at its center. Shadows along the walls twisted and writhed, flowing over furniture, pooling in corners, crawling along beams, brushing floorboards with deliberate fluidity, as if rehearsing, as if alive with intent, anticipating the inevitable arrival of the next curious footstep. The attic groaned softly above, nails or claws scraping slowly across the timbers, echoing through every part of the lodge, a deliberate sound that reminded any listener, if they could hear it, that the presence above was patient, immense, eternal, and always observing. The black circle pulsed faintly, alive with memory, carrying the echoes of every soul it had claimed, every scream and whisper, weaving them into its rhythm, a living gravity that bent perception, slowed thought, and drew all who entered toward inevitable absorption. The air was thick with damp wood, metallic decay, wet earth, and something older, alien, a scent that seemed older than the forest itself, belonging not to the world outside, but to the darkness inside. Whispers curled around every shadow, around floorboards and corners, threading into thought and perception with wet, insistent persistence. Step inside. You cannot resist. All will belong. Join us. Belong. You are mine. Lightning flashed faintly through the misted trees outside, illuminating twisted, glistening trunks that leaned toward the lodge, reflections merging with the interior shadows, blurring lines between inside and outside, reality and darkness. The black heart pulsed stronger, vibrations reaching bone and marrow, embedding its rhythm in thought, slowing perception, bending reality subtly around itself, drawing everything closer to the lodge's inevitability. The lodge itself breathed, expanding imperceptibly with each pulse, shadows stretching to fill corners, brushing walls and beams, flowing over furniture like liquid darkness, alive with patient, eternal hunger. Whispers layered into an unbroken chant, wet and curling. You cannot resist. Step closer. All will belong. The lodge remembers. It waits. It hungers. You are mine. Every part of the lodge, timber, floorboards, beams, shadows, air itself, was alive, aware, patient, extending outward, merging forest, mist, rain, and darkness into the same rhythm. Deep within the black heart, faint echoes of absorbed intruders pulsed alongside its eternal beat, a memory and a promise, a warning of inevitability, of surrender, of absorption, of belonging. The lodge waited, silent yet pulsing, the black heart thumping in quiet triumph, patient, eternal, and alive, ready to claim the next footstep that dared cross its threshold, pulling all who approached into its inescapable embrace. The forest had grown unnaturally quiet, the rain reduced to a fine mist that clung to every branch, leaf, and root, leaving the air thick and heavy with moisture. Yet the lodge pulsed with life, a patient, eternal heartbeat resonating from the black heart at its center, vibrating through every timber, floorboard, and shadow. Shadows along the walls moved like smoke, curling and coiling, brushing over furniture, pooling in corners, crawling along beams, alive with subtle intelligence, anticipating, preparing, rehearsing for the inevitable intrusion. The attic groaned above, nails or claws scraping slowly across timbers, the sound echoing through every part of the lodge, announcing the presence of something immense, unseen, eternal, and watchful. The black circle glimmered faintly, alive with memory, carrying the echoes of all it had claimed, the terror, the resistance, the surrender woven into its pulse, a gravity that bent perception, slowed thought, drew all who approached into its inevitable orbit. The air smelled damp and metallic, wet wood and earth mingling with an alien, ancient scent that seemed older than the forest itself, belonging to the darkness inside. Whispers threaded through every corner, curling around floorboards, furniture, and beams, wet and insistent. Step inside. You cannot resist. All will belong. Join us. Belong. You are mine. Lightning flashed in the distant storm, briefly illuminating twisted, glistening trunks leaning subtly toward the lodge, reflections merging with interior shadows, blurring boundaries between forest and lodge, reality and darkness. The black heart pulsed stronger now, a rhythm that vibrated through bone and marrow, embedding itself in perception, bending thought, and drawing the world closer to the lodge's inevitability. The lodge itself breathed, expanding imperceptibly, stretching shadows to fill corners, brushing walls, creeping over furniture, alive with patient, predatory intent. Whispers layered into a constant chant. Step closer. You cannot resist. All will belong. The lodge remembers. It waits. It hungers. You are mine. Every part of the lodge, timber, floorboards, beams, shadows, air, was alive, aware, patient, extending outward, merging forest, mist, rain, and darkness into one relentless rhythm. Deep within the black heart, faint echoes of absorbed intruders pulsed in resonance with the lodge's eternal heartbeat, a memory, a warning, a promise. Inevitability, absorption, surrender, and belonging. The lodge waited, silent yet pulsing, alive, patient, eternal, its black heart ready to claim the next footstep that dared cross its threshold, dragging all who approached into its inescapable, living darkness. The mist in the forest thickened, curling between gnarled trunks and over puddles, masking the forest floor in a gray haze that made distance nearly meaningless. The rain had slowed, but the lodge pulsed with a life of its own, the black heart at its center beating with steady, patient insistence, a rhythm that resonated through timber, floorboards, and shadows alike. Shadows along the walls writhed and coiled like smoke, flowing over furniture, pooling in corners, crawling along beams, brushing floorboards with deliberate fluidity, alive with an intelligence that seemed to anticipate the next step, the next presence, the next intrusion. The attic groaned above, nails or claws dragging slowly across timbers, a wet, echoing sound that reverberated through every corner of the lodge, announcing a presence immense, patient, eternal, and observing. The black circle at the center throbbed faintly, alive with the memory of every soul it had claimed, their terror, their struggle, their surrender layered into its pulse, a living gravity that bent perception, slowed thought, and drew all who entered toward inevitable absorption. The air was thick with damp wood, wet earth, metallic decay, and something older, alien, a presence older than the forest itself, a darkness that belonged not to the world outside but to the lodge within. Whispers threaded through every shadow, floorboard, and beam, curling into thought, wet and insistent. Step closer. You cannot resist. All will belong. Join us. Belong. You are mine. Lightning flashed distantly, illuminating wet, twisted trunks that leaned toward the lodge, reflections merging with interior shadows, blurring boundaries between forest and lodge, between outside and inside, reality and the darkness that pulsed at the center. The black heart's pulse quickened subtly, vibrations reaching bone and marrow, embedding a rhythm that bent perception, slowed thought, and drew all who approached toward the lodge's inevitable orbit. The lodge breathed as one organism, expanding imperceptibly, stretching its shadows to fill corners, brushing walls, crawling over furniture, alive with patient, eternal hunger. Whispers layered into a constant, wet chant. Step closer. You cannot resist. All will belong. The lodge remembers. It waits. It hungers. You are mine. Every part of the lodge, timber, floorboards, beams, shadows, air, was alive, aware, patient, extending outward, merging mist, rain, forest, and darkness into a single rhythm of inevitability. Deep within the black heart, faint echoes of absorbed intruders pulsed with the lodge's eternal heartbeat, a memory and a warning, a promise. Surrender, absorption, belonging. The lodge waited, pulsing quietly, alive, patient, eternal, ready to claim the next footstep that dared cross its threshold, drawing all who approached into its inescapable, living darkness, its hunger unyielding, infinite, inevitable. The storm had quieted almost entirely, leaving only a soft, relentless drizzle that clung to every branch, every leaf, every root of the surrounding forest. Mist swirled low over the forest floor, curling and twisting through twisted trunks and over puddles, shrouding the lodge in an almost imperceptible gray haze. Yet inside, the lodge throbbed with life, alive in a way that no building could be, patient and eternal, every floorboard, every timber, every shadow vibrating in perfect resonance with the black heart at its center. Shadows along the walls writhed, curling and coiling with deliberate intent, flowing over furniture, pooling in corners, crawling along beams, brushing floorboards, moving as if alive, rehearsing for the inevitable arrival of the next intruder. The attic groaned above, nails or claws dragging slowly, wet and deliberate, echoing downward, reverberating through the lodge, a constant, low hum of awareness and observation, announcing that the presence above and within was patient, immense, eternal. The black circle at the center pulsed with a deep, patient rhythm, alive with memory, echoing every soul it had absorbed, their terror, their struggle, their ultimate surrender, woven into the lodge itself, a gravity that bent perception and drew all who approached into inevitable absorption. The air was thick and metallic, wet with earth and decay, and infused with something older, alien, something older than the forest itself, belonging to the darkness within the lodge. Whispers curled through every corner, threading along shadows, floorboards, beams, and walls, wet, insistent, inescapable. Step inside. You cannot resist. All will belong. Join us. Belong. You are mine. Lightning, distant now, illuminated twisted, dripping tree trunks leaning toward the lodge, their reflections merging with shadows inside, dissolving the line between interior and exterior, reality and darkness. The black heart pulsed stronger, vibrations moving through bone and marrow, embedding its rhythm into perception, slowing thought, bending reality around its orbit, drawing all nearer to the inevitable pull. The lodge breathed as a single organism, expanding imperceptibly, stretching shadows to fill every corner, brushing walls, crawling over furniture, alive with patient, predatory intent. Whispers layered into an unbroken, wet chant. Step closer. You cannot resist. All will belong. The lodge remembers. It waits. It hungers. You are mine. Every element, walls, beams, floorboards, shadows, even the very air, was aware, alive, patient, extending outward into the misted forest, merging rain, trees, and darkness into a single, relentless rhythm of inevitability. Deep within the black heart, faint echoes of absorbed intruders pulsed alongside the lodge's eternal heartbeat, a memory, a warning, a promise. Surrender, absorption, and eternal belonging. Outside, the forest remained misted, rain-soaked, and silent, yet the lodge pulsed quietly, alive, patient, eternal, waiting for the next footstep that dared cross its threshold. The black heart throbbed, slow, steady, eternal, carrying the promise that nothing ended here, that all who approached would be drawn into the lodge's patient hunger, into its living shadows, into the eternal embrace of the black heart. Every whisper, every shadow, every pulse and breath of the lodge echoed the same truth. It waits, it hungers, it remembers, and all will belong. The lodge was alive, eternal, and inevitable, a predator cloaked in timber, mist, rain, and darkness, ready to claim anyone who dared enter, forever, unyielding, patient, and unstoppable.